Morning, everybody. I'm just trying to share out everything and make sure that it's out there. Hope everybody's having a great day. I am just kind of getting my shit together this morning. Let's see. I'm a little weirded out by the fact that my camera on YouTube is weird. I hope everybody's having a grand day. I'm trying to get stable and set up, and as you can tell, set up and stable is not necessarily my best fucking way to be. Not the easiest thing for me to do, apparently. Hope everybody's having a great day. Yesterday's conversation tended to be more about gender than anything else. And so I wanted to make sure and come in and continue some of that conversation so that we could touch on some of the other things that are on the thing. Though, I mean, we talked about a couple of the other things on my list of conversational topics for right now. And see what we can do. I'm just brain dead right now. There's been a lot of new information coming across, and so I'll probably be doing another video based on paleoanthropology soon, based on, or another live based on paleoanthropology, based on some of the stuff. I'm trying to get up the mental wherewithal to sit down. Yesterday's conversation is all on YouTube, my YouTube channel. You can reach through, it's Widda Ord without dots on YouTube. And yesterday's live with the conversation on gender is on there. It's not so easy to summarize. We were talking about the fact that gender roles in and of themselves are negative, and talking about what sacred gender is versus toxicity within gender. A lot of that has to do with roles within gender and the idea that gender has roles. Mainly because the idea that we have roles that are predetermined by somebody else and somebody else's ideas of perfection really ignore everything about us as humans. And some of those rules really ignore our biological needs and our biological drivers. Our biological needs and drivers are nurturing and community. And we've pretty much told men that they should ignore that completely. And so a lot of our gender roles and a lot of our ideas of gender are pretty toxic to humanity themselves, to people themselves, to both genders, to both perceived genders. And we talked about the difference between masculine and feminine not being in what other people see from you, but in what you feel yourself. So as a two-spirited human being, I embody both genders. And as a two-spirited human being, I personally would say usually I'm about 60% 60% feminine and 40% masculine. Over on YouTube, but when I look at those, you can't often see when my gender changes. You can't often see when I feel differently, because it's not about what you're perceiving differently about me. It's not about you perceiving me taking on more masculine roles. It's not about you perceiving me looking like what you view a man to be. It's about me understanding how I feel inside myself and my perception of self. So when I feel masculine, you may never see that. Usually my confidence is higher when I'm more masculine. And so some people might notice that. Usually there's a little bit more of a swagger to how I carry myself when I feel more masculine. So people might notice that. What people aren't noticing and what is important about my feeling of being masculine is the body dysmorphia that I experience, the feeling of having masculine appendages. Good morning, lovely. And the sense of self that changes within my head. Gender is all about perception anyways, right? It's not about biology. And so when we're looking at sacred gender roles versus toxic gender roles, we see that the idea of gender roles themselves is a part of that toxicity. And that when we look at sacred gender, there's not necessarily a role within sacred gender. It is about um, being nurturing and communal no matter what gender you perceive yourself to be, and ensuring that your idea of how you're nurturing and how you're being communal isn't about you imposing your thought processes on other people, but about uplifting their own ability to have their own thought processes, providing a stable ground for them to fertilize their own thoughts, to fertilize their thoughts for them, but not to create them for them, right? I don't consider myself envy. Because two spirit is medicine. It's an entirely different thing. So being envy or being dual gendered is a different thing. It's about how it's specifically about gender. And when we're looking at being a two spirit is both about embodying both genders, but it's also about healing both genders. The thought process is that to heal both genders, one must be both genders. To heal the kind of rift that we're dealing with within both genders, one must be both genders. And so when I never really consider myself like envy or things like that, just because they don't apply to the way I gender, if that makes sense, right? But I do respect and see those, and I do know a lot of people that do see and respect them. It's just the way I do it is a little different, right? Which is what it's supposed to be, right? We're all supposed to understand that it's okay to do everything a little different. We shouldn't be like fitting into anybody's thought process, anyways, right? We're supposed to create our own thought processes. And it is in the creating of that own thought process that we like get bigger, right? Like we do more, we do different things, right? That we create phones or create tools or things like that. It isn't that thought process of having your own thought process instead of following somebody else's thought processes that we get there, right? And that makes sense. Envy can be an umbrella term, absolutely. And so that's kind of what our conversation on gender was yesterday. It was like a 2-hour conversation on gender, so it's probably not all going to fit in that, but it is in the recorded live on YouTube, because all my lives, this is being recorded on YouTube as we speak. There are people over there on YouTube watching as we speak. It's a great place to go if I have the comments on, because it's gotten too big in here, right? Um, so the other thing I am working on is taking the lives that I have and breaking them up so that, like, 10-minute videos for TikTok and stuff like that, so that people can have actual little videos on the subjects that we talk about, because it's very hard for me I haven't been able to sit down and put Homo erectus into 10 minutes, right? I haven't been able to sit down and put my thought processes on narcissistic god kings into a 10-minute video. Like, for me, trying to work that down becomes difficult. I have recently had an idea that I might try, where maybe I can get it down where I'm using screen words as much as I'm talking, uh, because it's a lot of information. And while I talk fast, I don't talk that fast. So I'm trying to make sure that I'm in there. Well, and I don't think being cis het woman means subservient. And a lot of people think it does. A lot of people think that to be a cis het woman means that you are meek or subservient or any of those things. See, with my two spirit, I'm kind of, it's weird how I personally identify it. So I'm going to go over that a little bit, but understand that this is personal. It is not anybody else's. I thought I was bi for a long time, and then I realized that I wasn't bi. What it is that I'm two different genders, and each of those genders are attracted to cis het people. So the female gender within me is attracted to cis het men, whereas the male gender within me is attracted to cis het women. I would state that the female part of me is probably more cis het, but to my mind, the male part of me is very cis het too. It's just that you guys can't perceive the cis het of him, right? So I would say that the female part of me is very not our idea of gender, but very female, very cis het female. And I would state that the female part or male part of me is very cis het male, but because the modern perception of what masculinity is faulty. My perception of what masculinity is what that cis het is, if that makes sense, right? And so um, that was a point I had to reach an understanding, because I did. I thought I was bi for a long time. And then I realized I'm not bi. I'm dual gendered and straight in both dual genders, right? Neither one of my genders is gay. So um, it helps to have those understandings, right? It helps to have those deep understandings of selves. It helps when you're interacting with other people so that you can know going in how you're able to react, right? Most people would say that I have a more dominant personality. I don't like using the words dominant or alpha outside of kink personally. I think that anybody who needs to be dominant in their day to day, dominant personality is one thing, absolutely. But most people who look at the word dominant personality, look at the phrase dominant personality, look at a man who's very controlling, one who has to be in control of all aspects of his life, right? And including his wife and including his children, right? To me, that as a dominant behavior is toxic. That's toxicity to me. Um, I have no problem with kink, right? Like I would say that kink, I'm dominant kink wise, at least the masculine side of me is. Um, but when it comes to like people who are I'm a dom, or like that's their personality, or I'm an alpha, that's their personality. For me, that's very toxic and problematic, right? Because that's the need to control other people, right? That's the need to maintain control for others, and nobody should have a need to maintain control over others. Control yourself. The only person you should be working on controlling is you, right? So um, but I know a lot of people who think that way. And most of the people who think that way, you're right. Like women who don't come across as very submissive, or people that they perceive as female that don't come across as very submissive, they can't handle them, right? And it's their need for control. It's their need to be the dominant in a relationship, and it's because they don't have security and control outside of the relationship, and so they have to have control of the relationship because they don't have security within self, right? Right. And service, I think, is a huge part of that, right? Guardian and service. Well, and I think that the verbalization of the word guardian as a difference between protector, right, is huge too, because I think that protector has a tendency to enter into that white savior complex, whereas guardian doesn't, right? A lot of people who think that they are the protector of others, like a lot of men who are like, I protect all of the people, um, have a tendency to not let the people do their own thing, right? Like their idea of protection is I'm going to protect you from yourself too, right? Instead of letting people have autonomy. We were talking about that a little bit yesterday when we were talking about protesting slightly, and we were talking about gender roles, and we were talking about I have people that I have specifically, I have a Sami person that he was in Standing Rock as well. We've done a lot of water actions up and down the coast. Very close friend of mine, sometimes lover of mine, really amazing human being. And when we go to protests, and they're ex-military and they full battle rattle, like they don't dress in military gear, obviously they dress in Sami gear, but full battle rattle, plate, everything, right? And they look big and badass, and they are big and badass, right? They don't follow me around. They don't stand between me and the line. They don't interact. Like they know I'm there. They know where I'm at all times. And if something were to happen where I might need protection, they would absolutely step in. But they would never get between me and the line. Whereas I have other men who I hang out with, who I've protested with, who I've been active with, in Standing Rock and in 2020 in Portland and things like that, where they think that to protect me means that they have to stand in front of me, right? They don't understand the concept that I have every capability of protecting myself. I need backup sometimes, but I definitely don't need a shield, right? So people are like that. There are absolutely people who are violent and evil that walk among us. I would like you to think about why, though, right? That's not biological innate thing to our species, because things that are toxic to our species would be the end of our species. So innately, we don't have toxic things. things that are toxic are mutations that have come along down the road, right? They're not an evolutionary positive. They might be more of an evolutionary negative, because anything that's toxic to the development of a species, or to the development of a planet, or to the development of a culture, or the development of anything that is toxic is not something that's going to be innate within a species, right? If it was toxic qualities that were innate within us that are killing us now, they would have killed us then. We wouldn't have gotten here, right? So, yes, there are absolutely people who are evil, and absolutely people who are violent who walk among us. And I'm not going to state that any different than that. But what I am going to state is that that evil and that violence within them is manufactured by their life. It's manufactured by the trauma that they have been inflicted with, and it's manufactured by the indoctrination that they've gone through. There are many people on this planet who are born being told that they were born evil, and that their struggle in this world is to fight the evil tendencies within them so that they can be somebody else's perfection, somebody else's idea of what is perfect. And that they're taught the actual natural tendencies are evil, whereas ill natural tendencies, things that are toxic to humanity, right, are the positive, right? One of these that is really, and I've known for decades, and like I've understood this since I first started having sex. I've understood this probably even before that. We live in a society that tells us that, you can have trauma and still come from a good home. Having come from a good home doesn't negate the idea that trauma exists within the world around you. And indoctrination is trauma. And I did mention indoctrination, and indoctrination doesn't come from your house. It comes from the world. It comes from society. It comes from your church. It comes from your TV. It comes from your papers. It comes from your articles in magazines. It comes from everything online that you read and you see. Indoctrination isn't about your home life. And trauma isn't about your home life, right? These things can happen completely outside of that. Also, good homes are like good men. Who states that they're good? Because that's not good behavior half the time. A good home can be a good home where you get spanked every time you do something wrong, which is not a good home. It's inflicting trauma on you instead of teaching you how to do right, right? So our perception of what good is so often faulty. And that's part of the issue, which I was just stating. So our perception around sex teaches us that sex is a sin, that sex outside of the marital bed is a sin, and that we should only be having sexual encounters with people that we're head over heels in love with and we plan on marrying. This is our societal standard for what sex is, right? And in this, we have instances like mothers who will bathe their children in scalding water because of the fact that they had an erection when they woke up. Or mothers who will call their daughter a slut for 3 months because, and that's the only thing they say to their daughter for 3 months because they found out that their daughter gave head. We have this idea that sex itself is a sin. And so anything surrounding sex becomes sinful. This creates, if you make natural sex a sin, right? If you make a natural sex is probably not the correct word there. If you make vanilla sex a sin, right? Then you create this toxicity, this idea of sex being sinful, right? And you create this thought process within a child's head that sex itself is somehow taboo. Now, taboo is one of those things that if you create this idea, hi, Omi, if you create this idea of taboo, you create this, it's hard for our brain to distinguish where we're getting the awesome feel from, right? God, I don't remember, endorphins. It's hard for our brain to distinguish why we're getting the endorphins. We see this within children who will take a punishment for attention just so they got attention, right? So if you're teaching that sex is toxic, yeah, it's a part of that dissonance. But if you're teaching sex is toxic, and in teaching that sex itself is toxic, the simple act of sexual desire is toxic, or masturbation is toxic. When you're teaching those things and you're associating pleasure with taboo, and you're making pleasure wrong, right? So in your brain, when things are wrong, they're associating as pleasurable. So this creates this why we have grape culture, right? It's pretty much every mass sadist that we've had, or sadist serial killer or serial rapist that we've had, has talked about the taboo of it and that need for that taboo, because they have grown up in an environment, and many of them speak about these environments where sex was taught as taboo. There was something wrong with them for natural sexual desires. So when we teach natural things are wrong, it's easier to go to the things that are ill natural, right? We can't distinguish in our brains. It creates this cognitive dissonance. It creates this change, right, within the structure of the way we view things. So within this, we're creating a toxicity around sex. We're creating the idea that the act of sex is sinful. The act of sex is not sinful. Why? And this always blew my mind about Christianity. Why would God give you a gift and be angry at you for using it? The greatest gift of joy that God has ever given humanity, and he's pissed at you because you're playing with it? Like, what the fuck? Like, that's an evil God right there. That was my first understanding that there was a problem with God, right? Is that you have this God who gives you this great gift and says, don't fucking touch. What the fuck? Why? Why would you give me something fun and say, but you can't play with it? Just set it up on that shelf and watch it, right? So when we see that, and when we see that there is this toxicity and this indoctrination created around these things, we can see a correlation with what I'm saying about evil being manufactured. So when you're looking at the world around you and you see things like don't hit girls, this is one that we talked about yesterday, right? Don't hit girls. This is actually a very harmful, toxic indoctrination. Tell your children not to hit people. Your children should not be hitting people. Who the fuck cares what their gender is? They should not be hitting people. Okay. So, or animals. Don't hit other beings would be a good one, right? When we're looking at the idea of the simple phrase, don't hit girls, what we're teaching in these 3 letters, don't hit girls, what we're teaching within this is A, women are weaker, which is biologically false. Okay. What we're teaching is women need to be protected and it's your job to protect, which is also biologically false. And we are also teaching that no matter how much damage she does to you, don't do damage back. So we're teaching men to take abuse in 3 little words, right? And because we do this from the time our children can talk and walk and start interacting with each other, right? We are teaching and indoctrinating through loving, right? Because that phrase comes about out of love, right? That phrase comes about out of love. That phrase comes from a loving parent, right? But what we're teaching within this is several ideas that are false biologically. And we're teaching that it is okay for a man to stand there and be beat to shit by a woman. Don't ever hit her back. Right? That's what you're teaching, which teaches men that it's okay to be abused, which is not an okay thing to teach anybody. It should never be okay for anybody to accept abusive behavior. Right? So this is another one of these things where we see this indoctrination into it teaches us these ideals, and therefore evil is manufactured, along a lot of other things. Smirk, you are completely incorrect. So we see within the archaeological record that prior to 10,000 years ago, there's about 200 skeletal remains, not individual remains, but remains of individuals, about not 200, 2,000 skeletal remains. And of that 2,000, 2% can be possibly attributed to violence. And what do I mean by this? If I find a skull that looks like a rock has caved in that skull, I can't tell you 2,000 years later whether or not, or not 2,000, sorry, 2,000 stuck in my head now. I can't tell you 20,000 years later or 30,000 years later whether or not that person was hit in the head by a rock that somebody else welded, like I caved in your head. That's not strength, though. The way you can hit is not strength. How hard you can hit is not strength. And my partner is actually a belted MMA champion. And he will tell you there are women out there that can hit harder than men. Just telling you. And not watching, he's taken the hits. So he would know more than you would know by watching. Just stating. So when we are looking at violence within the archaeological record prior to 10,000 years ago, what we're seeing is 2% of possible things that could possibly be attributed to violence, not actual violence, not definitive violence, not something that you can look at and go, yeah, that's absolutely violent. That's absolutely violent, right? I love how people think that it's appropriate to tell people that they're wrong in a subject that they know jack shit about. Like, you know, jack shit about MMA, jack shit about MMA. You know, jack shit about anthropology and archaeology, but you think that your lack of knowledge is better than other people's presence of knowledge and that you should school people on it. That's toxic. That's a problem within you, and you should probably go see somebody about it. Just stating. Anybody who thinks it's appropriate to tell people that they're wrong about subjects that they've not only got extensive experience in, but you have no experience in, that's a toxic behavioral trait. It's pretty condescending. And it's one of those things that's been indoctrinated into you that you have the right to do and you don't. Take it elsewhere. So when we are looking at the archaeological record prior to 10,000 years ago, no definitive violence is present. There are 2% things that could possibly be attributed to violence, but is not attributed to violence. It's not definitive, right? So when we're looking at the archaeological record after 10,000 years ago, we see that the archaeological record after 10,000 years, the level of violence in the archaeological record becomes definitive, and the level of violence within the archaeological record skyrockets to 15 to 20%. One of the first instances of definitive violence that we have is in Kenya, where we have 8 people who were massacred. And we know that they were massacred because of the way they're all kind of lined up. And one of them is a woman who was pregnant, largely pregnant, and her hands are tied. So she is bound in a cross-legged sitting position on the ground with her hands bound under her belly, and then her head is caved in. This is absolute definitive violence. There's nothing else that this can be attributed to, right? So we see that at 10,000 years ago, the presence of violence starts in the archaeological record and becomes definitive in the archaeological record. We are 290,000 years as a species before this. And in that 290,000 years as a species, we don't see definitive violence anywhere. What happens at 10,000 years ago? Stratification happens at 10,000 years ago. The deification of narcissism happens at 10,000 years ago, or narcissistic personality traits happens 10,000 years ago. The rise of violence and the the manufacture of evil all happens roughly 10,000 years ago. And all of this happens roughly in the same space and then spreads out. And all of this happens around somebody else's need for controlling others, right? Around somebody else's need to hoard, right? And we're going to talk about how that happens. When we look in the archaeological record, I'm telling you that speculating that something is violent when it could be 2 or 3 other things is wrong. And I'm telling you the difference between definitive and non-definitive. So I am not the one speculating. You might be. And you have one more try, and then you're muted for this live because your behavior is not acceptable. This is my space. TikTok gives everybody who has 1,000 followers their own room. You can get your own room and host your own live if you have the capability. This is mine. And in my space, we follow my rules because this is my space. It's my house. I've invited you in. You can behave appropriately or get the fuck out. Period. In my space, there was only 9 people when we started, and they all knew me, so I didn't have to state this. In my space, we don't deal with racism. In my space, the theory of race has been debunked. Race doesn't exist. Culture and ethnicity exist, but race does not exist. Racism still exists, and we don't deal with it here. We cut it out. We get rid of it because racism and racist, that's evil. That's that manufactured evil we've been talking about. That's that shitty nasty that you've been interpreting and intoxicating and being a part of. We don't deal with it here. And we also don't deal here in phobias based on gender and desire. If you're going to be phobic based on gender and desire in my space, again, get the fuck out. Okay? Your toxicity isn't welcome. And if you're going to tell me that I'm wrong about something, you come with facts because I'm coming with them. I come with sources. I come with resources. I come with 40 fucking years of study on these subjects that I'm talking about. And I'm not going to sit here and be told that I'm wrong by somebody who doesn't have any facts within them, but just likes to spout and hear their mouth. That's mighty white of you. And I don't deal with old white men who think that just because they have a dick, they're important in this world. Your dick makes you less important, not more important. Period. Because your dick makes you think that you get to do everything and include attack others, include invade others, include harm others. And your dick makes you think that. And you think just because you got one, that's fucking okay. Not in my space, bitch. Take your dick elsewhere. Okay? So you have one more chance, motherfucker, and then you're muted. If they haven't muted you already. Period. Take your shit elsewhere. That's usually my spiel about my space. There were only a couple people in my space when I started, so I didn't have to. But yes, I can, Isa. So I personally don't believe that we are invasive or parasitic at all. I believe that what we translated into in the last 10,000 years makes us invasive and parasitic, but we are not invasive and parasitic. And actually, I'm not going to speak on this directly. I'm going to let somebody else who is amazing speak on this. This is Robin Wall Kimmerer's Braiding Sweetgrass. If you have not read Braiding Sweetgrass by Robin Wall Kimmerer, you should. Braiding Sweetgrass is, the subtitle is Indigenous Wisdom, Scientific Knowledge, and Teaching of Plants. I'm going to tell you who Robin Wall Kimmerer is so you know when I read what's inside this book, but this is going to address this. Robin Wall Kimmerer is a mother, scientist, decorated professor, and enrolled member of the Citizen Potawatomi Nation. Her first book, Gathering Moss, also beautiful, was awarded the John Burroughs Medal for outstanding nature writing. Her writings have appeared in Orion, O Magazine, and numerous scientific journals. She lives in Fabius, New York, where she is a SUNY Distinguished Teaching Professor of Environmental Biology and the founder and director of the Center for Native Peoples and the Environment. So this person is the foremost expert on moss in our country, in our world, and they are also an Indigenous person who teaches Indigenous medicine a little bit in what they're teaching. Braiding Sweetgrass starts with the story of Sky Woman, but we're not going to read that today. It's a beautiful story, though, and we'll talk about it in another space and time. Absolutely, Isa, and you should stick around. You should stick around. You'll leave here happier. I promise you that. Stick around. This will take me just a minute to find because this is something that happened in one of her classroom areas. And it's not one that I typically read about, but here we are. This is actually told, I guess, right after the story of Sky Woman, which is beautiful. So maybe, okay, so we're going to do it this way. First, I'm going to read the story of Sky Woman, and then I'm going to read the story of what happened in her class afterwards. And Braiding Sweetgrass is, and you can find it at your local library for free. And if your local library has like apps that you can have on your phone, she reads it for free from your local library as well. And she does, Robin Wall Kimmerer also does a lot of, she has a lot of YouTube and TED Talk videos that are amazing, just amazing stuff. So I would absolutely recommend finding her stuff. So this is Sky Woman Falling. In the winter, when the green earth lies resting beneath a blanket of snow, this is the time for storytelling. The storytellers begin by calling upon those who came before, who passed the stories down to us, for we are only messengers. In the beginning, there was the sky world. She fell like a maple seed, pirouetting on an autumn breeze. This is adapted from the oral tradition and Shenandoah and George in 1988. A column of light streamed from a hole in the sky world, marking her path where only darkness had been before. It took her a long time to fall. In fear, or maybe hope, she clutched a bundle tightly in her hand. Hurtling downward, she saw only dark waters below. But in that emptiness, there were many eyes gazing up at the sudden shaft of light. They saw there a small object, a mere dust mote in the beam. As it grew closer, they could see that it was a woman, arms outstretched, long black hair billowing behind as she spiraled towards them. The geese nodded at one another and rose together from the water in a wave of goose music. She felt the beat of their wings as they flew beneath to break her fall. Far from the only home she'd ever known, she caught her breath at the warm embrace of soft feathers as they gently carried her downward. And so it began. The geese could not hold the woman above the water for much longer, so they called a council to decide what to do. Resting on their wings, she saw them all gather, loons, otters, swans, beavers, fish of all kinds. A great turtle floated in their midst and offered his back for her to rest upon. Gratefully, she stepped from the goose wings onto the dome of his shell. The others understood that she needed land for her home and discussed how they might serve her need. The deep divers among them had heard of mud at the bottom of the water and agreed to go find some. Loon dove first, but the distance was too far, and after a long while he surfaced with nothing to show for his efforts. One by one, the other animals offered to help: otter, beaver, sturgeon. But the depth, the darkness, and the pressures were too great for even the strongest of swimmers. They returned gasping for air with their heads ringing. Some did not return at all. Soon only little Muskrat was left, the weakest diver of all. He volunteered to go while the others looked on doubtfully. His small legs flailed as he worked his way downward, and he was gone for a very, very long time. They waited and waited for him to return, fearing the worst for their relative, and before long, a stream of bubbles rose with the small, limp body of the muskrat. He had given his life to aid this helpless human. But then the others noticed that his paw was tightly clenched, and when they opened it, there was a small handful of mud. Turtle said, "Here, put it on my back, and I will hold it." Sky Woman bent and spread the mud with her hands across the shell of the turtle. Moved by the extraordinary gifts of the animals, she sang in thanksgiving and then began to dance, her feet caressing the earth. The land grew and grew as she danced her thanks, from the dab of mud on Turtle's back until the whole earth was made. Not by Sky Woman alone, but from the alchemy of all the animals' gifts, coupled with her deep gratitude. Together they formed what we know today of as Turtle Island, our home. This is one of the stories of how many indigenous nations along the eastern seaboard of what we call Turtle Island today for some of us came about with the name Turtle Island. There are other stories for how this name comes about, but this is the citizen Potawatomi and a few other nations' story of how this came about. Like any good guest, Sky Woman had not come empty-handed. Keep that in mind. We should all, as guests, not come empty-handed. The bundle still clutched in her hand when she toppled from the home in Sky World. The bundle was still clutched in her hand. When she toppled from the hole in the Sky World, she had reached out to grab onto the tree of life that grew there. The tree of life is one of these things that we see in many different indigenous nations and many different spaces across the world. It's not just a Celtic thought process or a Nordic thought process. It's actually a very global thought process the tree of life is. Oh, Sarah can talk today. From the tree of life, grabbed onto the tree of life that grew there. In her grasp were branches, fruits, and seeds of all kinds of plants. These she scattered onto the new ground and carefully tended each one until the world turned from brown to green. Carefully tended is important here. Sunlight streamed through the hole from the Sky World, allowing the seeds to flourish. Wild grasses, flowers, trees, and medicines spread everywhere. And now that the animals too had plenty to eat, many came to live with her on Turtle Island. Our stories say that of all the plants, Wingashik, or sweetgrass, was the very first to grow on the earth. Its fragrance, a sweet memory of Sky Woman's hand. Accordingly, it is honored as one of the 4 sacred plants of my people. Breathe in its scent, and you start to remember things you didn't know you'd forgotten. Our elders say that ceremonies are the way we remember to remember. And so sweetgrass is a powerful ceremonial plant cherished by many indigenous nations. It is also used to make beautiful baskets. And I have earrings that have a sweetgrass braid around them. You can use them in jewelry as well. They're in my bathroom. I'll show them later. Both medicine and a relative, its value is both material and spiritual. There is such a tenderness in braiding the hair of someone you love. Kindness and something more flow between the braider and the braided, the two connected by the cord of the plait. Wingashik, waves and strands, long and shining like a woman's freshly washed hair. And so we say that it is the flowing hair of Mother Earth. When we braid sweetgrass, we are braiding the hair of Mother Earth, showing her our loving attention, our care for her beauty and well-being, in gratitude for all she has given us. Children hearing the Sky Woman's story from birth know in their bones that the responsibility that flows between humans and the earth. The story of Sky Woman's journey is so rich and glittering, it feels to me like a deep bowl of celestial blue from which I could drink again and again, and I personally drink again and again from this one. It holds our beliefs, our histories, our relationships. Looking into that starry bowl, I see images swirling so fluidly that the past and the present become as one. Images of Sky Woman speak not just of where we came from, but also of how we can go forward. I have Bruce King's portrait of Sky Woman, Moment in Flight, hanging in my lab. Floating to Earth with her handfuls of seeds and flowers, she looks down on my microscopes and data loggers. It might seem like an odd juxtaposition, but to me, she belongs there. As a writer, a scientist, and a carrier of Sky Woman's story, I sit at the feet of my elder teachers and listen for their songs. Thought I wasn't going live. I wasn't sure if I was going to be in the rest of the week, but I did want to try and come in today, and that's why I'm here today. It becomes hard for me sometimes. This is interaction with people, and I'm extremely introverted as much as I love people. And it's energy expansion that can be hard sometimes. So I'm trying to do it in the morning so I can do it. I know I need to do it to ensure that I'm creating and maintaining connection, right? And so I know I need to, but sometimes it's a little bit much, right? So I am here. I wasn't planning on it, but I am here. And this is where we get into the answer of the question: do I think that we are parasitic? Do I think that we are locusts upon the planet? And this is where we go into that with her. On Mondays, Wednesdays, and Fridays at 9:35 a.m., I am usually in a lecture hall at the university, expounding about botany and ecology, trying in short to explain to my students how Sky Woman's gardens, known as the global ecosystem, function. One otherwise unremarkable morning, I gave my students in my general ecology class a survey. Among other things, they were asked to rate their understanding of the negative interactions between humans and the environment. Nearly every one of the 200 students said confidently that humans and nature are a bad mix. These are third-year students who had selected a career in environmental protection, so the response was, in a way, not very surprising. They were well schooled on the mechanics of climate change, toxins in the land and water, and the crisis of habitat loss. Later in the survey, they were asked to rate their knowledge of positive interactions between people and land, and the median response was none. I was stunned. How is it possible that in 20 years of education, they cannot think of any beneficial relationship between people and the environment? Perhaps the negative examples they see every day, brown fields, factory farms, suburban sprawl, truncated their ability to see some good between humans and the earth. As the land becomes impoverished, so too does the scope of their vision. When we talked about this after class, I realized that they could not even imagine what beneficial relations between their species and others might look like. How can we begin to move towards ecological and cultural sustainability if we cannot even imagine what the path feels like? If we can't imagine the generosity of geese? These students were not raised on the story of Sky Woman. On one side of the world were people whose relationship with the living world was shaped by Sky Woman, who created a garden for the well-being of all. On the other side was another woman with a garden and a tree. But for tasting its fruit, she was banished from the garden, and the gates clanged shut behind her. That mother of men was made to wander in the wilderness and earn her bread by the sweat of her brow, not by filling her mouth with the sweet, juicy fruits that bend the branches low. In order to eat, she was instructed to subdue the wilderness into which she was cast. Same species, same earth, different stories. Like creation stories everywhere, cosmologies are a source of identity and orientation in the world. They tell us who we are. We are inevitably shaped by them, no matter how distant they may be from our consciousness. This is a part of that indoctrination that I was talking about earlier, and this idea that we are toxic to ourselves, that we are evil, that there is a toxicity within our species, which is completely illogical in a biological sense, right? One story leads to the generous embrace of the living world, right? Sky Woman helps create Turtle Island from the help of all the animals around her, right? She brings her own gift with her, and she tends and she loves her gift. But she also is tending and interaction with the animals, and the interacting with the animals is really that tending part, right? She's interacting with the animals and the land in a tending manner, right? One story leads to the generous embrace of the living world, the other to banishment. One woman is our ancestral gardener, a co-creator of the good green world that would be the home of her descendants. The other was an exile, just passing through an alien world on a rough road to her real home in heaven, right? And then they met, the offspring of Sky Women and the children of Eve, and the land around us bears the scars of that meeting, the echoes of our stories. They say that hell hath no fury like a woman scorned, and I can only imagine the conversation between Eve and Sky Woman. Sister, you got the short end of the stick. What we learn with Sky Woman's teachings is tending. Every creature in our biome is here for a purpose. Look around you. Unless we created it ourselves, it was adapted to the environment to fulfill a niche in the environment, in the biome, right? So every species around you, be it plant, be it animal, even the dirt, right, is an adaptation to create an interactive biome. You have to have this interaction in the biome to ensure the stability of the biome. If you remove one thing from the biome, you destroy the stability of the biome, and it must readapt to stabilize. All the things that are created within the biome are created within the biome to fulfill a space within the biome. And those spaces within the biome are not negative spaces. So even if I am burning in a forest, like if I'm doing controlled burns through a forest, this seems at the surface like it might be a destructive act. But one thing that most people don't know is that pine cones don't actually open up and release their seeds until after they've been through a burn. So when we are looking at this is the fact that fire can be a healer instead of a destructor, right? Or the destruction that comes about with fire can heal, right? So when we're looking at this, do you mean we put any other species between us, Paradeath? Because I think you have a typo in there and I'm not exactly sure. And I just wanted to check. That's why I kind of ignored the comment, because I was like, I'm not sure exactly what you're trying to state there. So when we're looking at this, what we're looking at is our space in the biome. What is our space in the biome? If you look at the world around you, why would any biome adapt something for that biome to destroy it, right? That's not what biomes do. That's not what anything does. Our body doesn't adapt towards destruction. Our body adapts to end destruction, right? Think of COVID-19. Our body had to adapt to this new virus that has come out from our climate destruction. And it took us a minute for our body to adapt to this new virus, right? But within our body are the things that we need to adapt, the things that we need to create the antibodies for that, right? So when we're looking at that, what we're looking at is the knowledge that no biome creates things within it that are antithesis to it. Outside influences can create things within a biome that are antithesis to it or destructive to it. But the biome itself, the adaptations, it's going to adapt things to fit in. It's not going to adapt things to destroy. We scientifically are a species that comes from adaptation. So scientifically, like all species come from adaptation. So scientifically, we were created by the biome to fulfill a space within the biome. Okay. So what is our niche within the biome? The tree's niche within the biome is to kind of fertilize, is to kind of provide air, is to filter. There's a lot of niches that the tree fulfills within the biome. Thank you, Ami. There's a lot of niches that a tree fulfills within the biome. What do we fulfill within the biome? A fish fulfills within a biome several different niches. Some of them are filter. Some of them are being food for a different level in the biome, or not a different level, because level shouldn't be brought into it, but for a different species on the biome, right? So what is our niche? Our niche is tending. We were given this biologically nurturing and communal biology, right? That's who we are biologically. We are nurturing and we are communal biologically, and we are creative. We are the only creature on this planet that adapts its adaptations. There are other adaptations on this planet. Crows can make tools. Corvids can make tools. They can put together long straws and like make these long little tools to get to the things that they need. Monkeys have started to be able to do CPR. There's like a video in India of monkeys doing CPR on an injured monkey because they've watched people do CPR on injured people, right? Monkeys can do CPR. Monkeys adapt their homes. Gorillas make nests in trees. Fox build den. Beavers build dams with homes inside the dams, right? All of these things are adaptations of the environment. They're adapting the environment to create a home for themselves so that they can subsist within the biome. And all of these things that they are adapting within the biome actually suit the biome, right? So the beaver creating a dam is his adaptation to create the home so that he can live within this space, but it adapts the world around him. It tends the world around him in ways too, because by making the dam, he creates pools of water, right? He slows the flow of the water. And this can be extremely healthy in the way that the river is flowing or in the way that the environment is running. It can create greater fertilization in areas, right? It can help in different methods. So not only is the beaver adapting the biome to give himself stability, right? But he is lending, not but, and he is lending stability to the environment around him as well. So when we look at us, we have a niche within the biome. Our niche within the biome is to tend, not just us, but everything. We have gotten away from an animistic thought process, which is what we had prior to probably. So they're now stating there's new studies that state that the advanced evolution of our brain is when God comes into the play. So God doesn't come into play until after like 30, 40,000 years ago, when our brain gets into the shape that it's in now, which they believe is where our consciousness and the fast pathways or the fast firing things that come. So we now know that it is not the size of the brain, but the shape that matters. It's never the size that matters. It's always the way you play with it. So we now know that it's not the size of our brain that matters, but the shape of our brain that matters. And we also know that those neural pathways are created by things that we do. So personally, when I look at the archaeological record and I see that roughly 100,000 years ago, first Neanderthals and then ours start burying our dead, start creating cave art, and start decorating ourselves, self-decoration or decoration of your people so that you can identify, right? This is creation of conscious. This is, in my mind, the creation or the start of the id, right? That I am conscious of myself. I am conscious that I have autonomy and I am conscious that I have being, right? And so when we look at this, this is the start of the pathway that gets us to the point that our brain fully develops. Some people relate this to mushroom use. I haven't seen evidence of it. I know that there's people out there that believe it. That's not my belief. I mean, don't get me wrong. I support mushroom use always. Some people relate it to just being the only creatures left, though we weren't the only creatures left by that time. Or not the only creatures, the only human homo group left at that time, though we weren't the only homo group left at that time. So there's a lot of different ideas. Personally, to me, I think that the creation of the id creates the shape of our brain. The creation of idea of self creates the shape of our brain. That's my archaeological take. But I don't have I haven't published papers to support that shit. So they're showing that the idea of being a deity doesn't come down until way later. And I haven't read all the articles on it, so I'm not exactly sure what date that they're deciding the deity comes into play. I personally think that things like the Venus of Willendorf aren't necessarily a deity as much as they could be a symbol of fertility. Like I'm a midwife and I carry a Venus with me, right? Or the hats that the Venus of Willendorf and most of the Venus seem to wear, or the hairstyles that most of the Venuses seem to wear. Also, Rebecca, I think that those are signifiers. So the Venus, the hat part is the important part that shows, oh, this is our fertility symbol, right? This is what our midwives wear, right? But we don't know. These are that's speculative, right? That's my personal thoughts on the thought process. When we look at, though there are others that think that. So when we look at that start of this idea that we're moving from animism, which is the belief that we live in connection with the world, that we're no more than everything else, that we're just another animal on the planet, right? And that every part of this planet has autonomy. Every part of our biome is a being with as much of a soul or as little of a soul as we have, right? And so the concept that every part of our biome is autonomous and is its own soul, is its own being, right, with as much equal right as we have, shows us fulfilling a niche within that biome of tending that biome. when we look at the earth as just another part of us, right? When we look at the trees as just another part of us, when we can see the fact that all of these beings around us actually have communication with each other, actually have function and form, and actually have autonomy if we respect it, when we can look at those things, we can see that we have this space of tending the other animals and the other plants around us and adapting things for the betterment of the biome. Right now, we've gotten away from that. And a part of that is the difference between the story of Sky Woman and the story of Eve. A part of it is this idea that you were given a gift to destroy. I personally lead this back to the start of stratification, the deification of narcissism, othering as a means of control. All of this stuff up here is personally to me what that shift is. And when we see that shift, which starts at 10,000 years ago, personally to me, this shift starts with the belief that you can own property, right? To me, the idea that you can own a piece of the earth instead of belong to the earth yourself, right? So when you think that the earth is something that belongs to you, when you have control over it, instead of thinking that the earth is something that belongs to itself and that you belong to this space, we get this idea that you can own another being. And once we start getting into this idea that you can possess another being, it's just a domino effect, right? So for my understanding of everything that I have seen, okay, we are not locusts. We are not a parasite. We are acting like we are because there is a contingent of us who fully believes that. And we have been indoctrinated into it as a society, that it is our job to come here and destroy everything, that that's the only thing, that the earth is here. It's not alive and it's here for our destruction, that it's a gift that was given to us to do as we will. And most people don't treat things nicely that they're given, right? Instead of understanding that the earth in and of itself is its own autonomous soul, right? And so when we shift from that idea and we start thinking that we can own earth, we start thinking we can destroy earth. And then we start coming up with excuses for destroying earth. And then we start coming up with excuses for owning other people, for destroying other people, right? So these are things that we have created within our society. These are the indoctrinations that we live in, that the earth is an inanimate object, that the tree is an inanimate object. They have proven that trees communicate with each other, that trees actually create matriarchal-based clans in forest nations. And that within these matriarchal-based clans in forest nations, there's constant communication, right? So when we're looking at the fact that you don't believe science, Yosef, you're anti-science, it's kind of icky to be anti-science. Who thinks that the world isn't a living being? Most. So most people who follow the Bible don't believe that the world is a living being capable of autonomy. You know, in the United States, we had to designate a tree as being a single tree, not all trees, but a singular tree as being an autonomous being. Like we have a single tree here in the United States that has been around so long that they actually had to make a law that that tree itself was an autonomous being and nobody else had the right to do damage to that tree, right? The Torah is actually probably the best of the Yahweh-based books. Absolutely, right? Judaism is animistic in so many senses. Judaism interacts with the world. I would state that the people that perverted the Torah into the Bible created it into something else. They took away the animism that the Torah, that the Judaic people are very much a part of. I would agree. Part of that fact is the fact that nobody in Judaic thought process wants to convert me, right? This thought process comes around prior to Christianity, comes around several thousand years prior to Christianity, but Christianity really doubles it down, right? Really, really like just digs this thought process in, right? So yeah. But when we look at this, we see that our purpose within the biome is tending. Our purpose within the biome is care, that we do fulfill a niche within the biome, right? And fulfilling that niche within the biome is important. This is why I'm a total land back person, because from my understanding and everything that I have seen, the only way that we can change the climate destruction that we are causing with Western thought process right now is by returning climate or returning spaces to indigenous governance of space. And the reason being is because indigenous knowledge teaches equitable interaction with the biome, tending of the biome, instead of teaching the idea that you must instead be, or that you are instead a possessor of a biome and therefore can destroy it. And so when we can, and in a lot of places we have like permaculture and stuff like that, that's indigenous knowledge that's kind of being appropriated into something else. So this is why I am land back 100%, because by returning environment to indigenous cultures who understand that environment, then we can change the climate destruction that we are causing from the monoculture that we're using. So give me 2 seconds. My partner just woke up and I'm not going to get off, but I am going to go kiss them. Good morning. And I'm going to put on some deodorant because I forgot to. And now I feel weird. So give me a couple and I'll be right back. Okay. I will come and back and address that comment, because that's really good. Because our food supply process currently is killing us, and our food supply process currently is creating an imaginary dearth of food. Be right back. Yay, I love you. Honey, just stay. Graham, stay. I'll be right back. I'll be right back. I spilled one of your samples because I didn't have anything to drink. I figured it was Graham. My dog also ate my chapstick yesterday, and when I try and do lives without something on my lips get all weird. And it's hard to do the lives, and I've got sticky stuff, and so I'm using Vaseline. I'm going really old school. So how do we replace our food supply process? Again, indigenous knowledge. So indigenous knowledge teaches us how to tend in something called honorable harvest. Braiding sweetgrass is still like, it's an amazing book to read for many things. It also teaches about honorable harvest. I was taught about honorable harvest as a child. I grew up, the first 5 years of my life, I lived in an indigenous community in the Pacific Northwest. And then at 5, we moved out into the middle of the woods and lived in a teepee that my mother's grandmother had bought her. I was taught to harvest. I was taught to tend the wild. I was taught to hunt with my father. And when I was taught to hunt, I was taught to track. But I was also taught that when you kill an animal, you kill it clean and quick. You thank its spirit for what has been done, for giving you life, for contributing to this circle of life that we belong to. And then you utilize every part of it. Any part that you can't utilize, like maybe you don't utilize the guts, you leave that out for the other animals to utilize, right? So that it returns, or so it even sinks into the ground and fertilizes, right? You leave it out so that it can be utilized. Everything should be utilized. I was taught that when I'm tending plants, that I only take a couple of strands from each plant. And I only do it in the correct season. So there are seasons in which plants get pruned, right? We know, like with roses, that as you're entering into the winter season, you want to prune it all back, right? So that when the next season comes, it grows bigger and brighter. This is the same with all plants. As it's entering into its kind of dead season, you want to kind of prune it a little bit. You also kind of want to prune it a little bit, and it's when it starts getting bushier, you want to prune it back a little bit too, right? So by Robin Wall Kimmerer talks about this in a really beautiful way. That's if you want more information, is a really good way to go to. When we're looking at tending the environment, what we're looking at with honorable harvest and tending the environment, which is an animistic thought process that's pretty much global prior to stratification and prior to Western-based monoculture agriculture. When we're looking at that, what we're looking at is, I'm going out to get something for my family to eat today. I might take a handful of berries from this berry bush that has thousands of berries on it, but I'm only going to take a handful because I only need a handful, right? And this prunes, this helps it grow. I'm going to go over to Maybe I need some sage. I'm going to go over to the sage bush and I'm only going to take a little bit of it, just maybe a couple of sprigs. Maybe I'm going to get some potatoes or some root vegetables. I'm going to go and I'm going to dig up just a couple, enough to feed me and my family. And I'm going to leave the rest there for the next, for either the animals around me or for the other humans around me to bring in. And as I'm doing this, I'm going to take the things that uh, in pruning make the most sense, right? So I'm not going to take I'm going to take the ripest, right? Absolutely. Um, I'm going to allow things to grow better, right? Maybe I'm going to break off. Maybe I have a plant with sprigs that I like the leaves off of, right? So maybe it's got this really beautiful long uh, um, stalk, and there's bunches of leaves off of this stalk. I'm going to take a couple of the leaves from the bottom so that the leaves at the top are still getting sunlight and it's growing. And because you're taking a couple of leaves from the bottom, instead of it shooting out this way, or the energy and the nutrients shooting out this way, they're going to go directly up. So these up here are going to grow bigger and brighter. So when you are doing this in an honorable tending harvest, right, you're meeting your personal needs of food, and you are also ensuring that other people's food needs and the plant's nutrition needs and the rest of the biome's nutrition needs are met. So when we're looking at honorable harvest, when we're looking at tending of a place instead of monoculture, what we're looking at is the way that things are grown is healthier for the plants that are being grown, so they produce more. And by producing more, they feed more. Because we're not all having a Big Mac and fries and a milkshake 3 times a day, right? And eating way more than our bodies require. All of our nutrients are being met, and the nutrients of the rest of the biome are being met, right? So I think I looked the other day and we're like 330 million here in the United States. Or maybe it's all of North America. When Europeans arrived here, there was between 50 and 100 million people, or 50 to 100 million people here. I usually say 80 because it's a great midway point between the two, right? All those people were fed to abundance by the biome. And when Europeans documented what they found here, they documented vast tended gardens. The entire space was tended garden. The entire space was tended garden, from north to south, from east to west. All of Turtle Island and all of Abya, which is South America, were tended gardens documented by the Europeans. And within these tended gardens, everybody's food needs were met, right? Any indigenous space. Julian, you are correct. And in Australia as well, though I know that there's probably a better term for it. I have a lot of indigenous Australian friends, but I have not heard what the better term is for Australia other than the colonized term. That would be awesome to know. It would still take me a while to remember to pronounce it correctly. So even if you tell me today, it might take me a minute. But when we're looking at this, what we're looking at is that the tending of the space actually creates ability for more food needs, or more food meeting. When we look at the cities that were here, because there are vast cities that were here in Turtle Island when Europeans landed, unlike European cities, they were not diseased and they were not dirty. And the reason is because of the way the cities here worked versus the way cities work in a monoculture stratified society. Here, there was not a lot of waste. First of all, there's not a lot of food waste, right? Because you're eating everything that you're getting, right? And because it's right there every day when you're walking out, or because it's stored in a proper way, because there were a lot of storage techniques here. If you haven't followed Linda Black Elk on Facebook and on TikTok, actually beautiful, beautiful Indigenous human being. And she goes through and talks about food preservation from an Indigenous standpoint, and talks about different ways that she brings forth Indigenous foods, and she brings forth food preservation. Like, she teaches food preservation. She's an amazing person to follow and get some information on, or get some information from, right? When we are looking at this, we're looking here at spaces that are huge, vast cities that there's not a lot of waste in, because they don't have a lot of food waste. Because their food is usually fresh or better preserved than other spaces, they don't have a lot of disease based on food. Because they're not shitting and pissing in their rivers, they don't have a lot of cholera outbreaks. Because they are actually like being ethical and smart about their bodily waste, right? Because of the way that it's not like they all have vast latrines that they all visit. They go in the forest and pee, just different ways that the city itself is tended, right? And because the cities themselves are a part of the forest, they don't destroy the forest. That's a huge thing. When you can build entire 5,000 people cities without destroying the land around you to create those cities, it's actually much healthier for the land and it's much healthier for the people because the things that the people need within the environment around them are maintained, right? The ability to defecate and to get rid of bodily waste in a safe way is maintained. The ability to have food right outside your front door is maintained. When you do those things, when you can build those vast cities based on being in concert with the biome instead of destruction of the biome to create for yourself, you can actually build a more physically healthy biome, right? And this is, again, what we are here for. We are here to fulfill a niche, and that niche is to tend. That niche is to tend the entirety of the biome, not just our needs, but the needs of the animals around us, the needs of the plants around us, and the needs of the dirt beneath our feet. Our purpose here is to tend those things. We were created by the biome to fulfill a niche within the biome. So when we look at whether or not we can feed people, so I do know there's a huge difference between 80 million and 333 million, right? I do know that we have a lot of technology today that actually can help us within that stuff. Like we have a lot of hydroponic knowledge that was actually something that's really well known within the islands of the South Pacific. Hydroponic knowledge within the islands of the South Pacific, hydroponic knowledge within Tenochtitlan here, and that's in the southern tip of Turtle Island, right? It's in Central America. I can't remember geographically if Tenochtitlan is in Abayala or in Turtle Island. I apologize for that. I'm just bad with that. But Tenochtitlan shows a lot of aquaponics. We have aquaponics like in the Maori people and in several different people in the islands of the South Pacific. They would actually build islands. Like they would take their little island and through stones and earth, they would actually build it out and create Mexico City. Thank you so much, CK. Like I said, I've said many times, my geography sucks. But you would think I would know where Tenochtitlan. And it was in my thought process in Mexico City, like in that space, like I can view it on the map, but I was like, wait a minute, am I got it right or am I fucking it up today? Because Lord knows. So we had vast aquaponics within many of the islands of the South Pacific. So now that we have that knowledge, right, we can utilize that knowledge to feed more people, right? And we also, like recently we've had like AI developments where AI is actually creating ability to build like apartment buildings that are living apartment buildings, like trees that grow around your apartment, right? There are many different ways that we can create an environment where we can live within the environment where we're not taking up as much space as we are. Nobody needs 2,500 square foot per person. That's absolutely ridiculous. We need like 10 square feet. And, to get rid of some of our toys because we all have as many fucking toys as possible. So when we're looking at those things, we can see that there are many different tools that we can utilize within Indigenous knowledge that have always been here that have been ignored that can actually create a very healthy interactive biome that is actually healthier for us. So if you were to live in an apartment complex, I live in an apartment complex, and instead of having beautiful grass everywhere and cedar chips everywhere and rocks, maybe a couple trees, there were berries everywhere. And I've got a space out here that's got honeysuckle, and I love honeysuckle, but there was a potato patch. It's just a circular space. It's all honeysuckle. Maybe the potato patch is in there, right? If you were to create apartment buildings with living environment around them, garden environment around them, then you're feeding the people there, right? If instead of planting maple trees along our streets, we were planting peach trees and apple trees along our streets, then we're feeding people there. There are many different ways that we are not feeding people that we could be feeding people. And the reason that we're not feeding people is because we're trying to create a dearth. We're trying to create a manufactured, what is the word? A manufactured lack. And there's a better word, but I can't think of it off the top of my head. But we're manufacturing lack. We're manufacturing, this idea that we don't have enough food. Even with monoculture, which is very environmentally destructive and which is not good for our biological food intake, right? Scarcity, thank you. So we manufacture scarcity within our environment. Even with monoculture, we have enough food to feed everybody for free. We have enough food to feed everybody for free. They are throwing out thousands and thousands and thousands and thousands and pounds of food a day, not even a year, a day, so that they can create a scarcity so that you'll pay more money for it, right? So when we're looking at this manufactured scarcity is really, really, really affecting the way that we do everything. It's also affecting the way that we eat. We're pretty mononutrient in our diets anymore, right? Yeah. Well, and people are starting to grow their own food and it's illegal in some spaces. Like some places you can't put a garden in your front yard. It's illegal. Some spaces you can't own a milk cow. Some spaces like you can't do these things in some spaces because it's illegal. And again, that's that manufactured scarcity. That is their need to control us and they're using that food need to control us, right? So when we're looking at these things, we can see that this creation of scarcity and this monocrop really is unhealthy for us as well. So when we look at our diets, the vast majority of us, if we walked into the kitchen right now, we would have probably one grain in almost everything we eat. Trying to find things without corn in them is impossible. Corn syrup is in half of our stuff. Corn is in almost everything that we eat. Trying to find things that don't have wheat in them. Talk to anybody who's got a gluten allergy, right? Trying to find things without gluten or wheat within them is really difficult. So we have like a singular grain that really takes up the vast majority of our foods. For some people, it's wheat. For some people, it's corn, right? Yet most people have a singular grain that makes up the vast majority of their foods. Even their meat usually has like a breading on it or a thing on it that like, and like I was talking to somebody and it was meat and I can't remember what their allergy was, but it was to a grain based it was soy. They had an allergy to soy. And we were looking at meat and I'm like, well, where does your soy, I mean like steak, like a chunk of meat. I'm like, well, where does your soy allergy come into that? And they're like, the packaging. They the preservative that they put in it has soy in it. So even your meat has a grain preservative base in it, right? So when we are looking at these things, what we're seeing is that we have like a mono grain that affects the vast majority of our life, right? And even our things that are not grain based have a lot of grain based things in them, right? Which we're not we're not herbivores. People want to think that we're herbivores. Everybody wants to go vegetarian to save the animals. Nobody talks about saving the fucking plants because the plants can hear you eat them and they scream while you do it. Nobody talks about saving the plants, but we definitely talk about saving the animal that's dead before it gets to your doorstep. We are constantly eating this thought process that we should be more vegetarian than we should be, or more herbivore than we should be omnivore. We are omnivoric and we must have for biological health meat within our diet, the proteins and the fats from meat within our diet. Now, there are people who are allergic to meat. I have two friends in my life. One I don't really hang out with anymore, but I know of, and one that is my sibling. I spend a lot of time with them, who actually the meat gives them sweats, and the sweat, they're allergic to the sweat. So they can't eat meat because the excretion of the byproduct from the meat through their sweat causes breakouts across their body. So we do have people who can't eat meat, but this is something that's developed in their life. It's not something that started out that way. And if we look at the fact that the vast majority of meats have plant-based products in them these days, that can also translate through, right? So we have to understand that there is this manufactured idea of who we're supposed to be. This is not how we're supposed to interact with the environment. This is not how we're supposed to interact with our food. And the Western style monocrop agriculture is causing physical damage to us and causing physical climate destruction. And I specify destruction instead of change. Climate change happens. The climate changes, we change. Change is the only thing that never changes in this world. Change is the only thing that we all have to go through. Change is every part of everything. It's part of the environment. There are cycles of climate change. There is heating and cooling cycles on this planet. So climate change can be a misnomer, and people can go, well, climate change happens anyways. This is true. Climate change happens anyways. Climate destruction is a different thing. And climate destruction really starts with monocrop. We see that the first monocrops, the first start of husbandry of wheat and barley actually starts around the Nile between 15 and 18,000 years ago, right? So when we're looking at this, the Nile is a place that we've been living for millions of years. Humanity has been living along the Nile. It is more of the Fertile Crescent. It is more of the cradle of humanity than Mesopotamia will ever be. The space along the Nile, because the Nile floods, refertilizes itself every year. And because it floods, it also gives itself water every year. And so because of the way that the Nile floods and the way that the Nile works, the Nile is a space of fertility that we have had this advanced developments. Our first writing is in Egypt, outside of the cave writing that we've recently found from Neanderthals and from early Homo sapiens prior to 27,000 years ago. So other than that, our first writing is actually Egyptian hieroglyphics, not cuneiform. Egyptian hieroglyphics predates cuneiform. So when we look at this, we can see Homo habilis, Paranthropus boisei. These both lived along the Nile. The Nile is a space of sustenance for us throughout human history. Well, not history, human prehistory. So because history literally means written story. So in prehistory, when we look along the Nile, we see that the Nile is a space of fertility. So along the Nile starts the very first instances of husbanding crops. And what we see is that the wheat and barley husbandry along the Nile was actually okay and pretty healthy, right? There's not a lot of stuff that you're removing from the environment. You're just planting in space that's already open and empty anyways. And because of that yearly flooding, it's got that yearly replacement of nutrients, right? And because of that, it is absolutely able to grow a monocrop in a space that doesn't even have other things, right? And then these crops were taken to, I think, Anatolia, and I think East Africa. I can't remember the space in East Africa. I believe it's within the Yoruba population space over there, or what became the Yoruba population. And then Anatolia, which is Turkey today, right? And so these are the two spaces outside of the Nile that start the development and the husbandry of monocrop. And when we see this starting in monocrop agriculture, and husbandry of animals as well develops within this space at this time. And this is roughly 10,000 years ago, and we've known this for a while. When we see these starts of the development of the monocrop agriculture within these spaces, what we see is that instead of planting these things within a biome that already exists, a full and healthy biome, they strip the biome of nutrients. They strip the biome of everything in that. And I meant West Africa, and I said East Africa, didn't I? I meant West Africa because I'm thinking along this part of Africa, the part that goes like this before it goes down like this part of Africa. My geography is such a suck. And half the time I'll use terms that are antiquated, like terms that are decades old, because of the fact that that's how I remember them, right? Because that's how I learned. West Africa, the space in Africa that goes like this off the rest of it. So when we're looking at that, what we're looking at is this rip out of all of the parts of the biome that are already there to plant something else. So when we rip out all of the nutrients in the biome and we put something else in, what we're doing is we're not giving nutrients to whatever it is we're putting in. So in a couple of years, the nutrients that are left in the soil from all the other plants that were in the soil are now gone, and the crop starts failing, right? Try to be. So when we're looking at, and I don't know as much about West Africa and their early agriculture. I know more about probably their animal husbandry than their early agriculture when it comes to Western crop agriculture. Most studies have been done Anatolian, Middle East, Near East areas. Most studies have been done in the Mesopotamia area and stuff like that. So when I'm talking about these, we're going to be talking about the Anatolian, Turkish, Mesopotamia area. I think it's modern day Turkey, but I could be wrong too. Anyways, within this space, Bram, please stop. Bram. move my feet 10 times to get the dog to stop licking me. Um, so when we're looking at this, what we're starting is this early agriculture in these cities rips out everything that's there and it replaces it with monocrop. Our first city based on agriculture is called Angazal, and it is in Mesopotamia. It's in the Fertile Crescent area. It's in and in Angazal and this first city creates climate destruction in 300 years. It takes an extremely fertile valley and changes it into a destroyed climate within 300 years. And the way it does this is because it's ripped out all the nutrients within the environment, and in ripping out all the nutrients within the environment and replacing it with monocrop, it robs the environment of everything it needs to sustain its biome, right? And when you rob the environment of everything it needs to sustain its biome, you see that this robbing of everything within the environment that is needed to sustain its biome creates this destruction. Now this is, and I want to say it's an I'm trying to see if I can find the I actually have a page that goes over this city. I'm trying to see because I've got the book right here. And so maybe I can actually find out exactly which space within this that we see it. I do believe it was I think I saw it the other day and it was it is literally our very first. And what happened is they have this very fertile river valley. And in this very fertile river valley, they introduce monocrop, rip out all of that is there along the level of the river itself. And in doing that, they maybe if I look at it this way, I can find it. They send their animals up in the hills because they're husbanding animals as well. So in sending their animals up in the hills and keeping it right there local within that space, instead of their animals moving out in larger spaces, they kind of rob what's there as well. So we see within Angazal, there it is, mid 8th millennium BC, so that's 8,000 BCE. Okay. Angazal grew to be one of the largest sites in the region, even if the entire site was not occupied at the same time. Angazal probably had one of the largest populations in the Near East, approximately 2,500 to 3,000 people. Its inhabitants have herds of goats and grew domesticated wheat, barley, peas, lentils, and chickpeas. When we're looking at this, oh, I know it's in here and I just don't know exactly where. But when we're looking at this, what we're seeing is that in this destruction of the site, they really just turned it into a wasteland in 300 years. And they turned it into a wasteland in 300 years because of the fact that they were really stripping the environment of all of its nutrients, and they weren't replacing any of those nutrients, right? And because they weren't replacing any of those nutrients, then the soil goes dead, right? And so when the soil goes dead and the biome goes dead, you can't grow anything. And so they ended up having to move along. This is, I believe it's It didn't actually state, I was just looking and I don't think it actually stated in that space or in that part. I could only find one part that talked about Angazal. And there's another part in here, and I know that there is, but near Amman, Jordan. So this one is in Jordan. Yeah. So it starts, first occupation is 8,200 BCE. So by 7,700 BCE, 7,600 BCE, we see that Angazal is no longer there. And again, Jordan. It's Amman, and then it's, does it say the actual river? No, it doesn't. There is a space in here that does state the river, and I'll try and reread it and find it so that when we talk about it next time, I can tell you exactly where it's at. But this climate destruction that it causes within this time really shows that in the beginning, monoculture is really destructive to the climate and it has never changed. Um, we are a scientific species. We're a species that does science, right? And science is I see or observe something in nature and I make a hypothesis or a thought process of what that observation might mean. I predict what that hypothesis might mean, and then I test it, test my predictions. And if the testing proves true, then I have a theory. And if the testing proves false, then I return to the hypothesis in the prediction phase. Um, Monoculture has proven false as a testing phase from its beginning, anywhere outside of the Nile. And it wouldn't work along the Nile now because the Nile is dammed now. And because the Nile is dammed now, it is not receiving that constant yearly resupply. And I think the Nile floods twice a year, even that constant yearly resupply of nutrients to its soil, right? So monoculture doesn't have the cycling of nutrients, it doesn't replenish the soil, whereas indigenous life in the biome that's not removed or rearranged for other people's ease actually replenishes the soil. And in that replenishment of the soil, it creates the ability for the next year's crops to grow big. So if you combine that with the tending process that we were talking about earlier of honorable harvest, right? If you combine leaving indigenous things in indigenous areas, because that's where they grew and they're meant for that space and they've adapted to that space. And so they live well within that space and they provide the biome within that space, right? So if we return to that thought process and then we tend within that thought process, right, instead of controlling within that thought process, we will see a rise in food production. And again, our food production currently is way more than we actually think. We have manufactured scarcity in every country. There's manufactured scarcity in every country that we have. And this manufactured scarcity is about control, right? This goes along with that othering as a means of control. This is another way of control. So when we look at the first city starting in Ingazal about 10,000 years ago, we start to see our first empires start with Sargon. And our first start of an empire being Sargon, we see that Sargon's childhood is actually this very traumatic childhood. And in Sargon's very traumatic childhood, we see a theme that's going to be played out in the rest of the world. It's going to be documented time and time again, and it's going to be talked about time and time again. And this theme is an abandoned child in a basket on a river. So Sargon's story is that he was abandoned in a basket on a river and floated down the river, and a farmer pulled him out of the river. And when the farmer pulled him out of the river, he was raised by that farmer, and he developed this belief at some point within his life that he was the child of a deity, a river god. Now, we're talking about somebody who is farming, somebody who is a gardener, somebody who is, in all instances, when we see the story repeated, somebody who is poor, raising an abandoned child. So you have the abandonment issue, right? And then you have the dearth, the scarcity, the being raised within scarcity. And one thing that we have shown about being raised within scarcity is it develops this problem within you, this dysfunction within you where you have to hoard things, right? We see this in a lot of people who lived through the Great Depression. I knew people when I was growing up who had 4 or 5 deep freezes full of food that they would never fucking use, but they had to have those because they grew up in the Great Depression and they had starved many times during their lives. So a lot of times when you grow up in something like that, it creates this need to hoard what you didn't have so that you never run out again, so that you never enter into that starvation phase again, right? So when we look at Sargon's childhood, we see somebody who was abandoned. We see somebody who was raised within scarcity. And we see somebody who then grows up to take over an entire region. So when we're looking at this, what we're looking at is, again, I mean, this is somebody that we're reading through the eyes of history, right? So it's not like we have like psychologists who can identify these things, but we're looking at somebody who displays traumatic events that are related to the cause of narcissism within somebody, MPD within somebody. And we're looking at somebody whose symptoms or the things that they talk about or the things that they do display narcissistic personality disorder. So when we look at narcissistic personality disorder, we often see somebody who has an extremely traumatic childhood, often abandoned by one of their parents through this childhood, often raised in trauma, or scarcity, and who believes themselves to be self-important or more important than everybody else. This is that deity thought process, the child of a god thought process. When we look at most of our early kings, we see this pattern repeated. We see children who were abandoned by gods, and so therefore are abandoned by a parent, and therefore one of their deities was a god. We see children who grew up in scarcity, who then need to have everything. They hoard, right? And so the first hoarding is of food, right? Because money isn't really a thing so much then. When we see this, we see that Sargon and kings before him, because he's the first documented, so very likely the kings before him and kings after him, as are documented, very often display personality traits associated with MPD, right? But they create these, not but, and they create these communities based on that. And what they do is they convince all the people in the area that their bullies, their people, they associate with a bunch of heavy lifters, right? Can protect you. So if I'm a small sharecrop farmer, or not sharecrop, I'm a small farmer, I'm learning this new technique that, maybe it's just me alone, or maybe it's me and my village, right? There's going to be people who might steal my abundance of food. I'm going to be fighting against animals. I'm going to be trying to maintain, because monocrop does not provide us with enough nutrients throughout the year, whereas tending does, right? So I have to maintain my food intake because of the fact that I've created scarcity for myself. And so somebody comes along and pulls mob tactics, right? You need to pay me to protect you from me, right? And so you see these huge cities created based on this. You need to pay me to protect you from me. When we see this start with a peasant class, a low class that is the farmers, is the people who are actually working the land and tending the animals. And then you see that this goes up. Sometimes there's a merchant class, sometimes there's, a slightly higher class within this. And then you see your warrior classes, your higher echelon class, right? And so you get a standing army frequently. And then you see your king, your ruler on the top of this level, right? And when you're seeing this start of stratification, because that's what this is the start of stratification within societies, you're seeing that this start of stratification gets maintained by othering. Now, othering is hate anybody but me, right? Othering is I'm not the problem, they're the problem. So you see that these kings who are hoarding all the wealth, who are hoarding all the food, who are hoarding all the nutrients, right? Taking them from their farmer class, taking it from the people who are working the land, taking it and hoarding it. Now, I'm going to tell you that I have to take this to protect you from the barbarians in the hills. The barbarians in the hills is our first instance of othering. I am taking all of your food so that I can feed my army, so that you are protected from the barbarians from taking your food. Not that you have any food left, because I took it all, right? So this othering is this means for maintaining stratification. This means for maintaining a ruling class. And we see that this othering really goes down throughout society and is carried on even today. We see othering goes from the barbarians in the hills to when we have everybody in nations or in cities, or in agriculture based, it goes to that other nation is the issue. They're not as advanced as we are, or they're trying to steal our advancements from us, or they're trying to attack us. So you need to pay me to feed the army so the army can protect you. And it doesn't matter that you don't have food and I'm not protecting you anyways. We see it go from nations, and we see it go to women, and we see it go to women in Greece first, and then we see it go to women within Rome. Rome really doubles down on the women thought process as women as being inferior, though that does start in some Greek states. And after we see othering of women, we start to see othering of religion, when mono-religion, monotheism really starts, and the idea that before that, any place that has gods, many gods are the same. Loki is everywhere. Loki, coyote, spider, like Loki is everywhere. The mischief god is everywhere. The father god, or the male masculine archetype is everywhere. The female masculine archetype, or female masculine archetype. The female archetype is present everywhere, the hearth and the home archetype, right? So we see that these deities are cross-population present, right? So prior to this, like, I'm not going to hate you for worshiping Hera and Zeus. I'm just going to think that it's Odin and Sif, right? So when we're looking at this stuff, When monotheism comes in, we see the start of othering based on monotheism, based on my God worships you. If you're not worshiping my God, you're sinful. If you're not doing what I tell you to do or following my ways, then you're sinful. So othering based on religion. After othering based on religion, we start to see othering based on perceived race. Race, again, is something that has been debunked. Race itself does not exist. Racism still exists, unfortunately. Many countries are founded on racism, many current countries. And ethnicity absolutely exists, and culture absolutely exists. These things are based on genetic lines or inclusion within. They are not based on your skin color. It equates your intelligence level, which is what race was. And race is horrific and faulty and false. So we see the othering concept of race come into play, and we see the othering concept of race start to come into play in the 1400s and then finalize, and it's coming into play in 1492 when Columbus lands on the Taino people and starts eradicating a people that he can't state are sinful because they are very obviously not sinful. And so now he has to other not based on religion and sin, but based on, or they have to other not based on religion and sin, but based on color of skin, right? Race is not real. Race has been debunked. It does not exist. You know how we debunked it? We realized that there are more genetic differences within primary populations than there are between primary populations, which means you are, if you come from the Yoruba population of Africa, you are more genetically different than your next door neighbor within the Yoruba population of Africa than you are within the Sami people in Sweden. You are going to be more genetically similar to somebody who is Sami in Sweden than you are going to be to your next door neighbor. And when you think about this logically, this makes sense. Otherwise, we'd be inbred. We have to have the genetic differences within our primary populations or we become inbred, we become bottlenecked, right? And so when you think about it, it actually makes very common logical sense that we are more genetically different within our primary populations than between populations. Race itself has been debunked. It was a theory created by my field, and my field is the theory that has debunked it. So race is not real. Sorry. I know that some of us are kind of stuck on that. There's no reason to be, right? We're talking about the fact that hating somebody from being different than you is manufactured to keep control of you, right? That's what we're talking about is othering. Othering is creating within you a hate for somebody on your level so that you don't go after the people that are harming you, right? So othering is a means of control within a stratified society so that somebody can maintain control over you. Currently, our othering within our society is immigration here in in almost every country, and houseless. They're checking your genomes. Neither of those are race or geography. So genetic ancestry tests are looking at your genomes. They've even recently proven that those things that were like, well, Black people are more prone to heart disease have nothing to do with their perceived race and everything to do with redlining, everything to do with where they're grouped, everything to do with the way society has controlled and placed people, and that those heart problems aren't because of their genes, but because of the environment that they're forced to live in, right? So it's a completely different thing. It has been debunked. There is no new theory. Culture and ethnicity absolutely exists, but the idea that skin tone or hair color or eye color denotes your genomes is completely false. In fact, they've recently realized that a child so if I am a light-skinned person and I go to South Africa and I don't have the modern conveniences of South Africa, so I'm outside all the time, my child's going to be born with slightly darker skin than I am, maybe even much darker skin than I have, because they've proven that the presence of the sun or the absence of the sun during a pregnancy will actually affect the skin color of the child in utero, right? So there's the idea that skin color really has anything to do with it has kind of been debunked. We know that most of these things have to do with latitude, where you're at within sun and where you're at within heat, right? Recent studies have shown that the reason that we all start with 4C hair or altered tightly curled hair or tightly coiled hair, and as a species, we do all start sub-Saharan black with tightly coiled hair. We like our entire species starts like that. You didn't get light until much later. In fact, you haven't been light until like 5,000 years ago. Like we all started black, babe, right? So they've proven that tightly coiled hair is absolutely, it creates a lattice work and a shade over our scalp so that it cools our brains in a high sun environment. Uh, Kind of like the large noses that are protuberant with larger sinus capacities behind them for the Neanderthals creates the ability to warm the air before it hits their brain, right? So race itself has been absolutely debunked. As we're looking at othering, though, we see that the othering, we still have othering based on all those things, right? We still have othering based on the idea that barbarians exist. We still have othering based on the idea that your nation is not as good as my nation. We still have othering based on the idea that your religion is not as good as my religion. And we still have othering based on the idea of race. What we've also started othering based on is immigration, where you come from. Again, this kind of goes back to nationality and it kind of goes back to race and religion. Like it kind of ties into all of those. And then we also have othering based on houseless. Are you somebody who is no longer exploitable by the people on top and you are now houseless? Well, then we should hate you because you're no longer exploitable, right? We currently have a society based on what we can exploit out of each other. If I can exploit something out of you, then you have value. If I can't exploit something out of you, you have no value. We have lost the knowledge that we all have value just in existence. We have lost the knowledge that we are all valuable just by breathing. The trees are valuable just by being here. We have lost that knowledge, and now we believe that you must be exploitable to be valuable. And so when we no longer can exploit you and you become a husk of what you once were because we've exploited every last drop out of you, now we other you based on that, right? So othering is absolutely a means of control. This is absolutely a way for the narcissistic God kings, who we still have today. We just call them presidents or kings or chancellors or whatever else we're calling them. Those who are in control, those who, the government, those who maintain that stratification, those that are the 1%, the top echelon, they need you to hate anybody but them. They need you to think everybody else is the problem but them, right? And because they need you to think that everybody else is the problem but them, they're going to tell you to hate your next door neighbor. We saw this within 2020 where everybody was like, well, Antifa is getting paid. Bullshit. Do you really think the government is paying anybody anything? Let's look at our government. Our government doesn't want to be paying people who can't eat food stamps. Our government isn't about giving anybody money, right? So nobody within our government is paying Antifa, right? That just doesn't happen, right? That's not the way it is. We have people, there is currently on my page a video done by an Indigenous man talking about the fact that he receives prejudice from all sides, racism from all sides, right? And people are pissed from one of the sides. And it's not the white side, right? And in this, there is this lack of understanding that there is this violence and this hatred between specific groups here that are marginalized groups within Turtle Island. And this is manufactured again by the government. There is this idea that Indigenous people have been given reparations and Black people haven't. And this is false. Indigenous people have never been given reparations and Black people have never been given reparations, right? There is this idea that Indigenous people get paid a monthly check, which is again false. Some, not all, and I know many who don't, nations actually have a yearly, what they call per cap. And that yearly per cap gives them roughly $1,000. Like, not even like they're getting $1,000 a month for the year, but $1,000 for the whole year. And that doesn't come from the government. That comes from things like casinos. That comes from things like if they have a space that the government has decided to take in control and the government is robbing that space, they might be paying people yearly. In Kuwait, everybody gets paid constantly from the oil, right? Because the oil belongs to everybody, so all its citizens get paid. This is something similar to that, where say I'm robbing the Black Hills of gold as the government, I have to pay the local Indigenous nation because I have taken it from them, right? Sky, take your racism and your white supremacy out of my chat right now. Or shut your mouth and listen. Because you obviously don't know what you're talking about and you're upholding white supremacy in my chat, and we don't do that. Period. And you are actually proving my point. So take your racism and your white supremacy and leave my chat now. Or shut your mouth and learn to listen. So there is this perception that Indigenous people are being paid by the government, and they're not. They've never been paid by the government. In fact, their stuff is still being stolen by the government as we speak. Nobody has received reparations from our government, but because of the thought that Indigenous people are receiving reparations or that Black people have it better in this space, there is this fighting between those two spaces, right? There are groups within the Indigenous nation who have racism and prejudice against Black people, and there are groups within the within Black culture within the United States that have racism and prejudice against Indigenous people. Instead of realizing that by uniting, we can take care of those who have harmed both of us, right? Because it is not the Black people who stole Indigenous people's land, and it is not the Indigenous people who stole the Black people from their land, right? It is the Europeans who run the government and the government structure within the United States that did that to both. And as long as the government can keep you fighting each other, can keep us hating each other, then the government remains safe and in control. And that's what it's all about. That's what othering is all about. It is giving you anybody to hate except for the person that's beating you. This is what happens in an abusive relationship, right? When you have an abusive spouse, they blame their abuse on everybody else but themselves, right? And this is what we're dealing with the government. And a lot of this has to do with the fact that we've deified narcissistic behavioral traits. We deified control, and we deified the idea of perfection and that you have to achieve perfection. We've deified this. We've deified this within the Bible. If you read the Bible, the God of the Bible is a narcissistic parent. Like, he parents in a narcissistic manner to his people, right? And he does it so that they will laud his praises for eternity, right? He actually is very narcissistic in his interactions with Pharaoh and Moses. He's narcissistic in interactions with Job. He's narcissistic in the fact that he rapes a 13-year-old girl and forces her to carry his child in a society that will ostracize her for it. There is narcissism within every step of the way within the Bible, and we live in a society that deifies that, right? So when we're working within that, what we have to understand is that as long as we allow the government to convince you that it's your next door neighbor that's the actual problem, we're going to allow the government to harm us. We are in an abuse cycle with those who rule us, right? So othering is a means of control to maintain that deification of narcissism. This goes along with the conversation we were having earlier about how evil is manufactured, right? And how humanity itself is non-violent. The violence that we have currently within us today is something that was created within this stratification of society, within this need for somebody to have control over you, within this need for somebody to hoard and to take from you. And this isn't something that we see in the archaeological record prior to 10,000 years ago at all. We see stratification, monoculture. So 59, I understand why. And that's what I'm just talking about. Give me one moment. Hi, Mama. My phone doesn't work very well in the house, and I'm in the middle of a live. Can I call you back in like half an hour?
Absolutely.
I love you. I'll talk to you soon, Mama.
Okay, bye.
Bye. Sorry about that. Let me see. Can you hear me, or do I need to pause my live? Let me know if you can hear me or if I'm unhearable. And then I will talk about why I say that we are nonviolent. Okay, perfect. 59, what I'm talking about is our species as a whole. So our species as a whole, and the development of our species shows nonviolence within this. And I'm going to touch on that a little bit. We touched a little bit earlier, but not so much. And so let me go ahead and go into this. When we look at our species as a whole, we see a couple of things that are only seen within our species. One of those things that we only see within our species is what we call mandatory midwifery. This means that during childbirth, we have to have somebody help us have a child. This is because of the shape of the pelvic outlet and because of the shape of the head of the child and the shoulders of the child. And when we're looking at a child being born for a Homo sapien, specifically for a Homo sapien, though Neanderthals also had mandatory midwifery, they are the only other species on this planet that has ever had mandatory midwifery. When we're looking at the child being born to a Homo sapien, what we're looking at is a child that starts out with its nose facing backward as it enters the birth canal. It has to be turned a quarter turn for its oval-shaped head to go through the oval-shaped passage of the tilted birth canal. And then it has to be turned another quarter of a turn for its shoulders, which are the other side of the oval shape, right? This is kind of a T here, right? Oval front to back, oval side to side. The other oval shape to go through. And this brings the child to nose up and up onto the belly. Other primates, their children are born with smaller babies and larger pelvic outlets, and their children are born facing outwards. So as a gorilla, I can reach down between my legs and pull the babies directly up to my chest. I don't need any help. But sapien needs help. This shows that we must have community to give birth to our children. There's another thing that really shows our need to have community to raise our children, and also shows the nurture that goes into raising our children. And this is the fact that we have 5 life stages from neonate to adult. These 5 life stages from neonate to adult create the malleability and the broad knowledge within our brain. Without these 5 life stages from neonate to adult, we would not be the intelligent beings that we are. This is where our intelligence comes from. We are the only species ever to have 5 life stages from neonate to adult. Even Neanderthal only had 4 life stages from neonate to adult. And what I mean by neonate to adult is I mean from newborn to the time that the brain fully closes, which is currently 25 years for us. When we're looking at this, we're the only species that has 25 years of child raising. Every other species on this planet either has no time raising child, like snakes who lay their eggs and leave, or up to 5 years, which we see within elephants. Elephants are the other longest time from neonate to adult, and it's 5 years. Ours is 5 times that length of time. During this time period, our children must be cared for on a level that no other child on this planet is cared for, okay? No other child on this planet needs to learn to walk. No other child on this planet takes 2 years to be able to learn to walk, right? Or a year and a half, right? So we have to have nurture of that child to get it from that neonate stage to an adult stage. We have to feed it. We have to teach it to walk. We have to clothe it. We have to keep it away from the fire. We have to keep it away from sharp instruments. We have to make sure predators aren't going to kill it. We have to make sure it has all the things that it needs. It has water. It has community. It must have touch. It must have community. Failure to thrive is a real thing. They did a study in like the 40s and 50s where they took half of the orphans in an orphanage and put them in one room and the other half infants, all infants, in another room. And in one room, they propped their bottles and they never touched them. And in the other room, they hugged them and they kissed them and they touched them. And in the room where they never touched, they died. It's called failure to thrive, and it happens. So we have to have nurture to be able to grow through this period. If we're looking at our time as a species, even today, we have to have a community to get us through. So we have to today have somebody take care of our child while we go to work, right? We have to have somebody else make our clothes. We have to have somebody else make our child's clothes. We have to have somebody else kill our animals and do our harvesting for us, right? We have to have somebody else in the play to nurture our child from neonate to adult. A singular person can't do it. 2 people really shouldn't try and do it on their own. We've created this idea that we can, but let's be real, even then, we still have to have a community. Still somebody else is killing your food for you. Still somebody else is babysitting your child or teaching your child for you, right? So we have to have community to get us from that neonate stage to that adult stage, right? And this is a foundational part of our biology. It takes every member of community to nurture a child, to get that child from neonate to adult. It doesn't mean male versus female. Like, it's not all the women nurturing and all the men going out and hunting. They've recently proven that in hunter-gatherer cultures, women were hunting as much as the men were hunting. So when we're looking at this, what we're seeing is the fact that this time frame of raising our children requires a community. When we're looking at a time before now, if we're looking at a hunter-gatherer or a collector community, which are just two different types of prehistoric, pre-stratified society communities, right? Though they could have stratification, though we don't see a lot of places that have stratification within these. The difference between hunter-gatherer and collector is that a hunter-gatherer community moves with the seasons, and a collector keeps their home in the same place, and they go out to different spaces during the season. So when we're looking at communities on either scale, when we're looking at having to raise a child, when you might not have more than 30, 40 people, you need all the people of that community to raise that child. To go hunting big game, you want no less than 10 people. 20 to 30 people is ideal because of the fact that if you're going to try and take down a mastodon, that's a huge animal, and 10 of you is going to be a really hard kill, right? Same thing with going down to the river to gather water. If I'm going to go down to the river to gather water, I need other people with me. There might be a crocodile in that river, right? So when we're looking at these things, you can't have a singular person doing anything. A singular person doing anything is unsafe, right? It doesn't create success, and it doesn't create safety. And so when we're looking at prior communities, it's going to take at least 30 people to get a child from neonate to adult. Most animistic and most prehistoric communities are sorry, that's very true, what you said, CK, and it just threw my brain for a second. Most prehistoric communities, and now I can't remember what I was going to say, which is totally okay. So when we're looking at this, we're looking at ourselves as a species are very nurturing and communal. We're also very creative. Now, we recently this year learned that how we came about as a species and how Homo erectus came about as a species is through what we have considered a theoretical method of evolution, speciation, a theoretical method of speciation until this last year. We have several methods that we consider speciation to happen, and most of those are speciation through isolation, being isolated from your genetic group. We have recently realized that the way we speciate and the way Homo erectus speciates is what they call speciation through convergence. This was theoretical. They didn't know it could happen. Our speciation comes through a convergence of many other Homo species. So you have North Africa is the oldest Homo sapien we have currently in Morocco, and it is 300,000 years old. So this Homo sapien comes about from a community of probably antecessor heidelbergensis and ergaster and erectus, all living together in a community. I'm explaining to you right now, one shot, how humanity is not violent and how violence is manufactured. So I'm going to encourage you to listen, okay? So when we're looking at that start of our species, we're seeing the start of our species within groups of a lot of people that don't look like us. There's nobody within these groups that look like us, right? So we see a pocket of Homo sapien created in this band in North Africa, and a pocket of Homo sapien created in this band in East Africa, and a pocket of Homo sapien being created in this band of South Africa. And you see within these pockets that this pocket of Homo sapien is still living in a band. Band is based on non-genetic lineage. Tribe is based on genetic lineage. These are two ways of developing community. Tribe being genetically being citizenship through genetic lineage, and band being citizenship through citizenship, right? Just being there. So in these bands, because they're not based on genetic lineage, we see that pockets of Homo sapien are being created among pockets of antecessor, pockets of ergaster, pockets of heidelbergensis, and all of these peoples are living alongside of us in these bands. We see that it takes from 300,000 years ago to roughly 135 to 125,000 years ago for us to solidify as a singular species ourselves, instead of just being Homo sapien children of mixed descent, basically. We come from mixing. We come from being mixed. Like everything about our species is admixture from the very beginning. So when we're looking at this, what we're looking at is we are not created in an environment where we see other humans as the enemy. We're created in an environment where we see people that don't look like us as human, and we don't see them as the enemy. We see them as our grandparents or our cousins or our siblings, right? So we see that for the first couple of 100,000 years of our existence on this planet, we are interacting and living in communities that involve many other species of human within them. We see this as we start to move into the Levant area, into the Arabian Peninsula area, at roughly 150,000 years ago, and intermix with Neanderthals and stay there for 100,000 years ago before we start moving out across the planet. Again, one shot. I'm going to encourage you to close your mouth and learn to listen because I'm explaining it to you 100%, and you are incorrect. And I'm coming at you with degrees explaining something that science has taught me. Okay. So we see that we're belonging to communities of multiple individuals. And I had mentioned earlier, though it becomes really important today, that right now we have roughly 2,000 skeletal finds. And that doesn't mean like 2,000 specific remains, but it means 2,000 individuals. 2,000 individuals that we have found in fossil record prior to 10,000 years ago. Of these 2,000 individuals that we have found in the fossil record prior to 10,000 years ago, they see 2% have things that can possibly be attributed to violence. Now, what do I mean by possibly be attributed to violence? What I mean is we're not going to speculate based on something that could be either way. If I see that a skull has a cave-in spot on this skull right here, maybe, right? I'm not going to be able to tell whether or not that happened because somebody, a human, came along with a rock and hit them in the head, or whether or not they were in a cave fall or in a landslide, right? When we are looking at the possible evidence of, or we're looking at the evidence of possible violence within these things, or within these 2,000 remains, we're not seeing any violence that, or any. When we're looking at these 2,000 remains, we're not seeing any morphology that can only be attributed to violence. It's all morphology that can either be attributed to violence or can be attributed to something else, anything else, from somebody with a spear point in their thigh at 30,000 years ago. Now, does that mean that they were attacked by another human being, or does that mean that they were out hunting and somebody else missed the kill and hit them? Or does that mean that they were flint napping and they slipped and the point hit them in the thigh and it killed them because they sliced an artery, right? We can't tell if that arrow or that spear point in the thigh comes because somebody actually attacked them or because of an accident. At 10,000 years ago, we see a rise of things that can only be attributed to violence. And we see it go from 2% possible to 15 to 20% only, right? Like, this is definitive violence. There's no other way that we can attribute this. One of these is very early, roughly 10,000 years ago in Kenya. There is a massacre of 8 individuals. One of them was a pregnant woman who was sitting in a cross-legged position on the ground with her hands tied underneath her belly and her head was stove in, like execution style. So this is absolutely violence. There's no question that this is violence. By this point, we had 290,000 years as a species. We have only been violent for 10,000. So no, humanity itself is nonviolent. When we decide that we need to own the land, when we decide that we can own the biome and start deciding that we can own other people, is when violence starts. And we can absolutely see this within the archaeological record. We can also see this logically. When we look at things through a logical manner, we can see that no species has toxic things within them innately. There is no species on this planet that is innately toxic to itself, right? Inherently, but I don't believe that killing an animal is a violent act, and this is why. So within the cycle of life, as omnivores, we have to have animal protein within us. If I am killing, as I was talking about earlier, I was taught to hunt at a very young age. And when I was taught to hunt through an indigenous lens. And when I was taught to hunt, I was taught that it's a quick, clean kill, right? That's why I won't hunt anymore, because I close my eyes now because of trauma. And so I pull. I have a trigger pull now. And so I know that I can't quick, clean kill. So I won't hunt anymore. But I was taught quick, clean, kill. You thank the animal for what it is giving up so that you can be sustained, right? And you utilize every part of this animal, right? We currently know that plants can hear you eat them and they actually scream while you're eating them, right? So is the act of eating a plant violent, right? What I mean by violence is an intentful act of harm, right? That isn't, I don't view the circle of life as violent. I don't view a crocodile killing a human being as violent. I view that as an act of nature. There's a difference between violence, which is an intentional act of harm for no other purpose than the act of harm. And there's a difference between hunting or harvesting, or this is a really good thought process on it. If somebody is in an abusive marriage and they're getting beat every fucking day, and one day they've had enough and they shoot their husband or their wife, whichever one is abusing them, are they violent? It's an act of violence, but are they violent? Is the act itself violent? Even though it's considered an act of violence, is it violent? Right? So when we're looking at violence within humanity, we absolutely see, yes, there's a difference between violence for the act of violence and violence for living. That's a great way to put it. And it's not, if I'm beating the shit out of you to beat the shit out of you, I'm being violent. But if I'm hitting you back because you're hitting me, I'm trying to stop the violence that's happening to me. Protecting and defending yourself, even if it is protecting and defending your means to live, is not violent. It's maybe using an act that we view as violent to do it. Yet it is, violence is as much perception within the mind as it is action, right? It's as much what you're trying to do as it is the action itself. And I don't view hunting as a violent act, right? I don't view harvest as a violent act. It may be killing something, and yet it's not violence, right? It's sustaining life, right? And the cycle of life is important, and the understanding of where we fit in that cycle of life and the fact that we are a part of a cycle of life is important. So when we look at violence within the archaeological record and that rise of violence within the archaeological record, what we're talking about often is violent acts that have to do with land ownership or possession of different things. And often violent acts against large groups of people, or violent acts to maintain, not defend, but to possess, right? Except for the fact that you put oppression and control in there. So oppression and control in themselves are act of violence, right? Controlling something else and oppressing something else is an act of violence, right? So using violence to maintain your violence is not an excuse. And don't get me wrong, people will excuse anything. Doesn't mean that they can. It just means that they're going to try, right? Yes, absolutely. And we are just an animal hunting other animals. Not necessarily within our species until recently, right? But just another animal, right? No, they can't justify it by survival right. And this is why they can't justify it by survival right, because you do not need to control or oppress another person to live. Your right to life does not include the right to suppress others. It doesn't include anything but your right to breathe, your right to eat, your right to have space to live safely, and your right for warmth. These are the things that are necessary to live. Those are the things that are necessary to survival. You can't state that your right to life includes your right to oppress somebody else, because that is not something that you need to survive. In fact, oppressing somebody else negates not only their right to life, but negates your right to life. Rights come with responsibilities to ensure that everybody has those rights. So if something is a basic human right, like the right to life, then you have the responsibility within that right to ensure that everybody else has the same basic right that you do, right? So status and lifestyle aren't a right. It's not necessary for you to survive. You're talking about you're really on the point here, but you're not seeing the point. We're talking in here about hoarding. We're talking in here about maintaining control through government structure and through means of othering, manufactured evil, manufactured scarcity. We're talking about that in here, right? Your status and your lifestyle are not your right. You don't get those innately. That's not something that you have a right to on any level. It's not survival, it's greed. You don't get the right to hoard. You get the right to breathe. You don't get the right to hoard the air. You get the right to breathe the air. Right? Absolutely 59. So when you're talking about their right to oppress you and their right to control you, they don't have that right. They've made you think that they have that right so that they can. And you don't get to be violent to somebody to maintain your control over people. That's another act of violence. If humanity is non-violent, I'm assuming is what you meant there. Why does violence still come naturally to us in the modern day? It doesn't come naturally to us. We're not naturally violent. We become violent because scarcity and trauma and indoctrination, right? We are not born violent. No child is born violent. The first violence that we see in most children is when something's taken away from them. And usually when it's their only thing, or I only have one of this toy, right? So when we see a dearth created for the child, a scarcity created for the child, is where we see violence in children, right? We don't, or we see like somebody is giving more affection to this child than they are to that child might become violent because they're missing out on the affection and they're doing it to try and get the affection and the attention, right? So the reason that it is so prevalent within us today is because it's indoctrinated into us and we're trained to be that way. And because it is, on many ways, our only outlet for the trauma that we're dealing with, right? We're taught that we're taught that males specifically are supposed to be violent. And we're taught that the only way that you can get away from violence that's being done to you is by lashing out violently. And we're taught that the only way that you can make it ahead, the only way that you can maintain your lifestyle and your status and your control, as this person was just talking about, is through violence. And we're taught that we have the right to maintain our status, the right to maintain our control of others. We're taught we have the right to control anybody. You don't have the right to control even your own fucking children. We do not have the right to control another being. Not our dogs, not our trees. We don't have the right to control another human being. Many people take that idea that they can control anything, right? But nobody has the right of control. It's something that we've kind of indoctrinated into ourselves. Again, it's indoctrinated in. We as a species, like every other species, does not develop traits that are toxic to it naturally. We have mutations that are toxic to us, right? Those mutations that are toxic to us are mutations that were frequently created within us. And they're mutations that have been maintained. And they created an idea within us that has been maintained. Yet no species is toxic to itself. That's an antithesis of species development and survival. And if we believe that our purpose here on the planet is to propagate, right? Which is ridiculous because it's not. But if we believe that our purpose here on the planet is to propagate, then violence is an antithesis to the species too. It's toxic. And we can't develop toxic traits naturally. Our speciation isn't going to develop toxic traits within us. Narcissistic personality disorder is a mutation. Narcissistic personality disorder, I personally believe I can trace where it starts, and I personally believe that I can trace why it's so prevalent within society today. As we were talking about earlier, we see with our earliest kings in our earliest stratified society, we see God kings. And when we see what has happened to them in their documented childhoods, we see that their documented childhoods are childhoods of trauma, and they often believe that they are the child of a deity because of an abandonment within their childhood and then being raised with scarcity and trauma. And because of this, this is pretty like textbook how we see narcissism really start in anybody that doesn't have it genetically, because there is like the aggression gene that you can see for MPD. So we see this start with this belief that you're the child of a deity after having been abandoned. This is it right here. So in the documentations of Sargon, the first king that we have documented, we see this. When we see a lot of our other god kings come throughout history, almost all of them, even Moses starts out as an abandoned child who believes that they are chosen by a deity, or that they're a child of a deity, which gives them this better than everybody else. So I deserve. And then because of the fact that they are living a childhood of scarcity, they develop the need to hoard. We see things like within the 20s, people who went through the Great Depression still have a need to hoard today because they starved. And so they have to hoard food so that they don't ever starve again. So dearth, lack, scarcity, trauma will create a need to hoard, right? And so we see within our first narcissistic God kings that there's this narcissistic thought process within their child, or this narcissistic creation within their childhood, and this narcissistic thought process as it goes up. So then we get a society that's based on stratification. And the only way for you to ensure that your children are going to eat is that you marry somebody who's higher on the stratified level than you are. So now we all start marrying the sons and daughters of people with narcissism. And as you're starting to marry the sons and daughters, so the grandsons and granddaughters of people with narcissism, and the gene for narcissistic personality disorder develops within us as a human, as a mutation within us, right? Because the trauma happens, triggering this thing within us, triggering this change within our pathways, epigenetics, things like that have proven that trauma will actually change the wiring of our brain, right? So when I think it does, but I'm absolutely positive. This isn't, so my study is anthropology, not psychosis, right? So it's kind of like, I know some of these things because of some, like, so when and they have been rewarded genetically. Not only have they been rewarded genetically, but they've kind of been bred for. So to try and maintain survivability, we try and marry within the higher ranks and have children within the higher ranks so that our children can eat. Almost everybody on the planet alive today is the descendant of a king. Genghis Khan's descendant are like in the millions and millions, right? Pretty much anybody who has English descent background is a descendant of a king or queen of England. Pretty much anybody who has descendant backgrounds in any space that has had stratification and rulership is descendant of one of the kings or queens through the history of that place. And really, if you trace us back like 15 generations, 10 generations, we're almost all related anyways, right? So we're all trying to marry into this higher echelon so that our children have food, our children live, our children survive. And in that, we start multiplying narcissistic, the gene for narcissistic personality disorder, right? And again, that gene comes from the trauma creating the epigenetic trait within the brain with the mutation, right? So I don't think eye size caused it. Neanderthals were almost extinct by the time we met them. There was like 10,000 left by the time we met them. They had gone through 2 extinction events that had almost completely extinct their species, and they were extremely inbred by the time we met them. There is more Neanderthal DNA on the planet today than there ever was during their time as a full genome species, though. So Neanderthals didn't die out. They were enveloped within us, and they didn't actually go extinct. They're still here today. They were here for 600,000 years as a species genome whole, which is a very long time for a species, and twice as long as we've been here, right? So people affected by trauma from narcissists can become more narcissistic, or they cannot. We see that narcissistic parents will either create children who are narcissistic or create children who are easily victimized by narcissism, right? And we see that it can create other personality disorders. Again, we get back to that epigenetic mutation, right? This mutation of the pathways of our brains. the reward complex within our brains, right? And so it creates this mutation in the way we work, right? What stops or slows or alters or helps heal this generational glean? So that's really a big thing. That's one of the things that we talk about within here often. Um, for me, I think that's a few steps. One, we have to understand that we are nurturing, communal, and creative. All this idea that we are born evil, all this idea of somebody else's idea of perfection, all this idea that we are supposed to be following a monolithic thought process is causing problems for us, right? So the first thing that we need to do is, as a species, realize that the things that we've been indoctrinated to believe in are not true. No, I'm not. And I did state that I'm talking as an anthropologist and an archaeologist, not as a therapist. And I've actually stated I can't tell you all the in-depth because that's not that's not my career path. I'm an archaeologist and an anthropologist, and I'm talking about it through the lens of an anthropologist and an archaeologist, and geneticist, not through the lens of a clinician or a therapist. So when we're looking at who we are biologically, we can see that we are nurturing, communal, and creative. We can see that around us has created a community that is none of those things. And so a vast majority of us actually are dealing with a lot of depression, a lot of anxiety, right? Because everything around us feels wrong, because it is, right? It's antithesis to our health as a species to be so traumatic to each other, to cause so much trauma to each other, right? We currently live in a society, if you're here in the US, feeding the homeless can get you thrown in jail in some places, right? They put spikes on benches and make sure that nobody can lay down, right? The idea of helping each other, where we live in a society that is dominated by a religion that talks about helping each other the entire fucking time. It seems to decide that you only need to help people that you view are worthy. So we live in a society that doesn't have community anymore, and it doesn't nurture each other. And because we live in a society that has no community and has no nurture, we are depressed and anxious, and some of us struggle to leave our homes, right? These are natural reactions to the trauma that we are living through, because we are living through trauma in our society. And because we are living in through trauma in our society and we have these natural reactions, a lot of times we have a tendency to think that we're the problem. A lot of times we have a tendency to think that it's our fault. A lot of times we're just depressed because we can't figure out a way out of it. The way out of it is the realization that this is not who we are, and the encouragement of that realization within everybody, that we don't have to act like this, that we don't have to be this, because this is not who we are innately. This is something that's been manufactured and created within us, but innately we are nurturing and communal and creative. And because we are innately nurturing and communal and creative, if we can return to the thought process of being nurturing and communal and creative, we can eradicate the thought process of take. We can eradicate the thought process of hate. We can eradicate the thought process of othering. We can eradicate the thought process of government maintaining control over us. We can eradicate the thought process that you have to be violent to maintain your space, right? Your nickname screams you make bad choices. I'm not sure how my appearance says shit on my choices. My appearance does advertise who I am. I'm an indigenous human being who puts a lot of focus into my ancestries, and puts a lot of focus into helping others and to healing. Bad choices, right? And that thought process is part of the problem. Smaller communities can be easier. Larger communities can be hard. It also depends on how you community. Thank you, thank you. It also depends on how you community, right? So if community is done in an egalitarian process, then larger communities aren't problematic. There's this thought process that in communities over 500 people, violence starts and stratification starts. And yet we've seen communities of thousands and thousands of people that didn't have violence or stratification within them. The Potawatomi, Citizen Potawatomi Nation, the Potawatomi Nation is one of them, right? The 5 nations of the Iroquois, Iroquois being the wrong word, but I can't remember the name of all the different nations, the Haudenosaunee and the Potawatomi and the Anishinaabe. Fuck. These 5 nations actually had vast cities of thousands and thousands of people, and they didn't have all of those things within them, right? Babalina, just go then. You don't have to be here. Nobody's making you. This is my space. And if you don't want to be in my space, I'm not asking you to be. Find somewhere else to space. Maybe go get 1,000 followers, though I doubt you have them, and create your own space. If you have the nerve, the courage, and anything to talk about other than being hateful. So when we look at how we can return to an animistic thought process and this thought process that is nurturing and communal rather than hoarding and exploitative, personally, I believe land back is the start. I think that if we can return tending and control of land or governance, tending and governance to indigenous nations across the planet, because there are indigenous nations that are still active across the planet, still living in their spaces, still maintaining an indigenous thought process, and still maintaining an indigenous cultivation of the planet. If we can return, if land back can happen on a global scale, then we get ideas, information, and we can translate this back into the communal sense that most indigenous communities have. It doesn't mean anything's a monolithic. Not all indigenous communities have that, right? Yet we can return it to that thought process of community and nurture, right? Eat the rich. We overthrow them. We overthrow them. We burn it to the ground and start anew. We realize that this experiment failed and we burn it to the ground and start anew. And that's the only way through it. It is easier said than done. Way easier said than done. And let's be real, we need more people ready to do that, to get there. We're a country founded on revolution, but revolution is like so far from our mind right now, right? So lots of humans come together and agree, though. There's so many different groups that agree. And you can start this process right now. Find your local indigenous nation, go to their tribal office and say, these are my skill sets. What can I do to help? This is my skill set. What can I do to ensure that you get land back? What can I do to ensure that your community has everything it needs? So we can all do that today, right? What can I do to ensure? Now, if you do this, do not go in and say, this is what I have, so this is what I'm going to do. You should never tell people what you're going to do for them. That's controlling. And you don't know what they need. You should ask what they need. You should always say, this is what I can do. What can I do for you? Or what can I bring to the table? Or how can this work for you, right? Because you should never put the weight on them to have to decide what you can do, right? But you can go in and go, this is it, and this is what I have. What can I do, right? Well, the United States itself is founded on an idea of revolution. The European conquest of Turtle Island is absolutely takeover and violence, right? Well, and this is one of the things that we were talking about. We have the Black slave descendants here in the United States and the indigenous people of the United States, who are often at odds with each other instead of uniting, right? As long as division can be created within us by the government, as long as the government can continue this divisive process between us, then they maintain control. If we can stop listening to the divisive rhetoric that is being pushed and start unity, start working together. What do you need? I need this. How can I help? I need this. What can we do together to ensure both of our needs are met, right? If we can do that, then we can make those changes. We can't make those changes as long as we're bought into the same old fucking shit, though. As long as we buy in, as long as we're indoctrinated, we can't affect change, right? Real, Micah. Real. I was somebody fucking on my... Yeah. So I'm going to take off. This live has been recorded on YouTube. My YouTube is in Widda Ord. I did go over what I mean by humanity is nonviolent. Any other questions that you have, I have probably already gone over them. So if you would like to go back and watch this live or other lives where we've also talked about this subject, they are on my YouTube in Widda Ord. I do have to go. I've been here for like 2.5 hours, and I really kind of have to go and do something. Oh my God, that's adorable. Thank you, Miranda. That's fucking cute as hell. I will be back. I can't tell you when, just because I can't structure. If I structure, it works very badly for me. So so if you would like to go and watch any of these lives on YouTube, they are there. I will be back soon. I want to, and Widda Ord, it's the same as my username on here, except without the dots. I want to, before I go, double down on a couple of things I've stated here today. One of those things is that we are nurturing and communal and creative as a species. That is who we are as a species biologically. These are the things that are innate to us. We are not innately evil. There's not two wolves fighting within us. There is not a perfection that we're supposed to attain. Okay? We are innately nurturing, communal, and creative, which means we're also really innately like unique. We shouldn't be monolithicizing an idea of perfection, right? You live in a society that exploits everything you are. It exploits every drop out of you. And it tells you that unless you're exploitable by it, you have no value and you have no worth. It is lying to you. You are worthy and you are valuable to our species continuation by sitting in the chair that you're sitting in, by breathing the air that you are breathing. You have worth and you have value. Period. No question to it. So when you are living within this space where you are depressed, anxious, hurting, understand that that is a healthy reaction to the world around you, to the trauma, to the indoctrination, and to the problems that society is creating. This is healthy to feel these ways. If you don't feel that way in the society around you, if you don't look at the lack of community that you have and go, fuck, that hurts. If you don't look at the lack of nurture around you and go, fuck, that hurts, there might actually be a problem with you. You might actually have some issues. That's usually narcissism or other personality disorder along those lines, because it lacks compassion, because you're lacking compassion in that. If you are not hurt by the society around you, then you might have a problem. If you are hurt by the society around you, you are having a natural reaction. Not only are you worthy just by existing, you are part of who we need in our world to change and affect change. You can only affect change if you see it, if you see the need for it, right? So when you are sitting here depressed and anxious because of the pain and the trauma that you're dealing with in the world around you, you are more necessary. You are more worthy. You are needed, because it is only those of us who can see that, who can understand that, who can try and work towards a difference that can affect that change, that can take us back to where we were in an animistic thought process and get rid of the pain that we are all going through. So when you are dealing with this, remember that you are needed. When you are living in that depression, when it threatens to carry you away, remember that you are needed and you are necessary. And remember that this pain isn't because there's something wrong with you. This pain is because there's something right with you. And there's something wrong with the world around you. Much love to everybody. Please give yourself grace. Give yourself grace. Remember how beautiful you are just by being, right? And remember how necessary you are just by being. And give yourself some grace, because it's another hard thing for us to do within our society. We're taught not to give ourselves grace. We're taught not to nurture ourselves. We're taught not to take care of ourselves. Please remember that you need to give yourself grace, and that you are a beautiful, amazing individual just the way you are. And that individual is okay, because it takes many individuals to interact on a communal level to make sure that all the needs of the community are met. It takes many different talents to act on a communal level to make sure all the needs of the community are met. Nobody should try and be a monolith, right? Thank you, everybody, so much for your time today. And I will be back. Can't say when, but if you follow me on YouTube, it does alert you better than it does here. TikTok doesn't seem to alert people very well. Ash and I'm disabled as well. And I feel that. It's very hard, isn't it? My worth for a long time was based in my parenting or in my relationship status or in my role as a soldier and a frontliner. And when I could no longer do many of those things because of my disabilities, it was hard. And I struggle today to remember that I'm worthy. We all struggle to remember that we have worth. And if you can realize and understand that everybody is struggling to remember that they have worth, sometimes it's a little bit easier, right? You don't feel as alone and you don't feel as unworthy. I've spent my entire lifetime thinking I was the problem. I had to go through some real intensive therapy to stop thinking I was the problem, right? I decided I couldn't kill myself because that would be more of a problem. So I would disappear into the middle of the woods because then I wouldn't be anybody's problem and I'm a problem in everybody's world. Right? So I feel that hardcore. You're worthy just by breathing. We are all worthy. We are all continuing our species just by being here. And just because your worth can't be measured by somebody else's need to exploit you does not mean you lack worth. It actually builds your worth to not be exploitable. To not be a member of the exploitable population builds your worth to the species as a whole. To not be somebody that's able to be exploited by everybody around you. Now, that does not mean that people who are exploitable still are less worthy, right? That's not what that means. And please don't take it that way. What it does mean is that when you are no longer exploitable, your worth becomes just being a human instead of what somebody else can get from you. And when your worth is the fact that you are just a human being, continuing our species, whether you're having children or not, right? But continuing our species as a whole, instead of what can be exploited out of you, your worth can't disappear. Because when your worth is what is exploitable from you, when they exploit you from everything you are and leave you as a dried up husk, your worth disappears. Yet if your worth is the fact that you exist, your worth cannot disappear by somebody else's measure. You are worthy and you are necessary. And again, those of us who can see that are more necessary, because it is only those of us who can see it who can affect the changes that we need to get back to a space that we need to be in to save our species, because we are causing the extinction of our species, the climate destruction that we're causing, right? And a reminder, because it was something that was asked very early on and something that needs to be reminded at all times. We are not locusts. We are not parasites. Our purpose on this planet is tending and caring for everything around us. We are the benefit, not the pain. We have to remember that we are the benefit, not the pain. We are not the parasite. We are the healers of this planet. And if we can remember that, then we can get there. Mistopheles, I did record this entire live as we're doing it. It's still recording on YouTube. You can go there and watch it. I'm leaving. But we will probably talk about it again. And yesterday's live, which you can find on YouTube, was all about gender. So if you would like to go there, it has the same background, different shirt on the Sarah. But you can go to my YouTube. It's in Widda Ord, same as this, just without the dots. You can go to my YouTube, and on going to my YouTube channel, you can find yesterday's live that goes over sacred gender completely. Have a great day, everybody. Much love. Bye. I'm going to take off now. Stop talking, Sarah. Those of you still left on YouTube, thank you so much. Have a great day, and I will see you guys soon. Much love.